The majestic palace, crowned with a large blue tower, was surrounded by high walls, behind which loud cries were heard announcing the arrival of an important personage, whose visit caused quite a stir among the local residents. Noblemen dressed in exquisite attire strolled leisurely around, engaging in animated conversations about the warm, pleasant weather and admiring the well-tended plants adorning the marble balconies of the magnificent building. In the center of the courtyard stood a snow-white altar, decorated with statues of angels, whose delicate features and graceful wings emphasized the magnificence of the architecture, creating an atmosphere of grandeur and awe. Loud, hurried footsteps suddenly echoed down the long corridor, breaking the silence as if conveying the sense of haste and excitement that had gripped everyone awaiting the arrival of the high-ranking guest. The heavy door was securely locked, but from behind it came a muffled noise, indicating that someone was approaching. The sounds of footsteps became more and more distinct, increasing the tension in anticipation of what was happening. Suddenly, the door swung open with a loud creak, and a knight with an excited expression on his face stepped forward, addressing the prince in a loud and firm voice, as if he was in a hurry to convey important news. The heir to the throne stood majestically in a long scarlet cloak, edged with luxurious fur, and next to him were two devoted servants who respectfully helped him dress in ceremonial robes. Around his neck glittered an expensive gold chain decorated with sparkling precious stones that shimmered in the candlelight, as if reminding him of the grandeur and wealth of royal blood. The man, remaining completely unperturbed, asked in an indifferent tone about Celicia's arrival, casually spreading his arms out to the sides, while the servants diligently completed his dressing. The prince turned sharply, raising his eyebrows in surprise, as the knight told him the alarming news. It seemed that something terrible had happened that required the immediate attention and intervention of the heir. Edgar Burgundy, the heir to the throne, was the epitome of aristocratic charm. His flawless face, with its sharply defined cheekbones, radiated nobility and confidence, but this news made him think. It turned out that Celicia had disappeared, without a trace, causing a wave of unrest. Below, in the cold and gloomy vaults of the dungeon, eerie screams were heard echoing off the stone walls of the prison cells, as if the place itself was absorbing the pain and suffering of the prisoners. In one of the cells, a young man hung in chains, chained to a damp stone wall. His shirt was soaked in blood, the red stains standing out brightly on the fabric, and every tremor spoke of the unbearable pain he had been subjected to during the interrogation. Chained to a damp stone wall in a cold dungeon, the missing lady's butler, Cain, stubbornly refused to say a word, breathing heavily, his head down, as if even the air was a heavy burden for him. In the square in front of the palace, an angry crowd, barely held back by the ranks of armed guards, loudly expressed their discontent, which echoed throughout the city and sounded like the waves of a raging storm. Evil rumors spread throughout the city, claiming that the heir to the throne, Edgar Burgundy, and his family had been found guilty of treason and murder, and were now awaiting imminent execution, adding fuel to the fire of popular anger. At the edge of the noisy crowd, like a shadow, stood a man with a dark hood covering his face and black hair. And although he did not interfere with what was happening, his tense silence distinguished him from the angry mass of people. On the dais, where all attention was focused on the man announcing the verdict, a decree was read out in a loud voice, appointing a substantial reward for the capture of the second son of the royal family, a fugitive named Aias, which made the crowd even more animated. The sky was overcast with gray clouds, and the rain was falling in small cold drops that trickled down the boy's hood. He raised his face to the sky, letting the water wash away the tension, as if the rain could carry away his bitter thoughts. The noise of the crowd did not cease, and the people, as if deliberately detached from the tragedy, indifferently discussed the rumors about the murder of the lady whose destiny was to connect with the emperor. Their indifference seemed to indicate that, for them, this story was empty gossip. The mention of treason sounded like an irrevocable sentence, and the bloody nobleman, with dark, tangled hair, with a heavy gait and a drooping head, walked to the place of his execution under the watchful eyes of an indifferent crowd. With cold determination, someone grabbed the metal lever tightly and, without flinching, pulled it down, setting in motion a mechanism that doomed the man to death, leaving behind only the dull sound of a falling body and silence. The mysterious stranger, in a long hooded cloak, standing in the shadows nearby, slowly bowed his head, listening to the echoes of someone else's pain and fear that filled the air and dissolved in the rhythmic sound of the rain. Before the people stood the very same traitor, Aias Lortragon, who had been wanted for a long time. His name sounded like a symbol of shame, and his presence caused a storm of emotions mixed with hatred and contempt from the crowd. After 5 long years of silence, the ancient dragon, the last of its kind, finally awoke from its centuries-long slumber, its massive body shaking the air as it flew over the dense forest, leaving behind a storm of wind and broken trees. Enormous, powerful paws, with long claws, fell on the hard stone, crushing it until it cracked. Then the dragon stepped onto the ground, shaking it with force and causing everything around to vibrate from its monstrous weight. The beast's powerful tail struck the stone wall with a ringing and roaring sound, leaving a deep dent in it, as if nature itself was retreating before the wrath of a powerful creature awakened in rage. Flapping his huge wing, the dragon let out a piercing cry, full of pain and anger, blaming those who dared to steal his magic stone, which was the source of his strength and pride. His eyes full of unbridled hatred, his pupils narrowed like thin slits drilled into the space in front of him, radiating a threat and power that was impossible to resist. The dragon could not stop thinking about where the culprit of what happened had disappeared to, and his mind was torn between anger and the question of where to find this impudent thief who dared to steal what was rightfully his. Slowly turning its massive head from side to side, the creature looked around carefully, listening to every sound and sniffing the air, trying to catch even the slightest trace of the one who caused its rage. The dragon roared furiously, and in his thoughts sounded the inevitable fate of the thief. When he was found, his body would be torn to pieces, and every piece of him would serve as a warning to others. The precious red stone, which was not just an ornament, but a source of powerful magic and power contained in its ancient depths, had to be returned for its loss, meant humiliation and loss of power for the dragon. The dragon's huge paw, framed by black claws, slowly reached out to the medallion that the thief seemed to have accidentally dropped, and touching it awakened in the creature memories of the magical connection with the lost relic. The dragon's sharp claws closed around the lost item, and at that moment it began to glow with a blinding light that pierced the darkness around it, as if the magic itself contained within it was awakening to life. A pillar of magical energy burst forth from the medallion, bright and dazzling, rising high into the sky, swirling like a whirlwind, as if nature itself were submitting to its majestic power and ancient will. Suddenly, the dragon's body began to blur in the rays of magical light, and soon, instead of a formidable beast, the figure of a man appeared whose features emerged from the radiance as if his true appearance had been sealed for centuries. The man still held the same medallion in his hand, but now it looked even more significant, as if it was not just a magical artifact, but contained some kind of personal sacred memory. Inside the locket, a wonderful picture appeared. A miniature portrait of a girl with snow-white hair, deep red eyes, and a soft smile. She was dressed in an elegant blue dress that harmoniously emphasized her exquisite beauty. Meanwhile, the village nearby continued to live its measured life. The market was buzzing with conversations, the voices of traders were heard, the smells of fresh products filled the air, and no one suspected that ancient magic was happening nearby. On the walls of buildings hung images of the missing lady, whose face filled with mystery was on display for all to see in the search as she was wanted, and everyone around had to identify her. Suddenly, one of the portraits was abruptly torn from the surface of the wall by someone's hand, as if someone was in a hurry to hide the traces of her presence, leaving only the mystery and secret enveloping this face. A mysterious figure dressed in dark clothes stepped forward, and beckoning passers-by attracted attention to itself, as if an invisible force was pulling people, forcing them to stop and turn their gaze to it. The man dressed in a dark cloak handed over several photographs, among which was the very beauty, and asked the strangers who this lady was trying to get at least some information about her. The men looking at the photograph quickly recognized her, and without hesitation, answered that it was none other than Lady Celicia, whose name had long been associated with secret and mysterious events. Suddenly, one of the guy's gaze stopped on the stranger's bare feet, and as if nature itself forced him to pay attention to details, he felt something strange draw his attention to her feet. Tilting his head to the side, the man, carefully observing the lady in the cloak, thought that she was probably a foreigner, since her manners and appearance were clearly different from the locals, which immediately gave her away as something exotic and unfamiliar. Having received a short and rude answer, the guy became nervous, and without wasting time, pointed to the western hill, which was visible in the distance, claiming that it was there that there was a landmark that could help find the right place. On the top of a snow-covered hill stood a majestic castle, its gloomy outlines standing out against the snow-white ground, and it seemed not only old, but also full of hidden secrets ready to be revealed only to the brave. The guys added that the road to the hill would take about half a day on foot, but even if the lady decided to go there, it would be impossible to meet her, since the castle was hidden, and it was extremely difficult to find it without precise directions. The strange lady pushed the guy aside when he spoke up, saying that only a palace servant lived in the palace, and that the lady herself, the former lady, had died 5 years ago, and now the palace was empty without her presence. Suddenly, the man's eyes widened in surprise, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening, and his gaze became glassy, full of bewilderment and shock. He froze, his hand stretched high in front of him, as if he wanted to say something or stop the moment, but his body was motionless, unable to move. The guy's friend, noticing his comrade's strange reaction, could not resist, and looking at him with concern, asked what had happened to him, since his behavior was so unexpected, and unlike his usual, that it was impossible not to notice. Suddenly, with an expression of extreme surprise on his face, the man, almost at a loss for words, exclaimed that the mysterious lady in question was the very same Lady Celicia who had disappeared many years ago, leaving behind only rumors and secrets. The night sky stretched out above them, its dark depths pierced by the light of the moon, whose brightness was reflected in the countless stars, creating an atmosphere of mystery, as if the whole world was waiting in anticipation of the revelation of an unknown secret. Against the backdrop of the majestic castle, which towered like a silent witness to history, a blanket of snow spread out softly, covering the ground, and around, like guardians of the night, mighty fir trees spread out their dark silhouettes, clearly standing out against the night sky. The girl stopped near the castle, her gaze never leaving the majestic walls, and she suddenly realized that she would have to spend some time in this mysterious place, although she did not know what exactly awaited her. The lady stepped inside, where silence and darkness reigned, but her eyes instantly caught the extraordinary beauty of the architecture, with its high arches and a long corridor that stretched into the distance as if hiding its secrets. As she continued on her way, she realized that the house looked abandoned, and despite its grandeur, it seemed forgotten by time. There were no people, no signs of life, and her footsteps echoed in the empty rooms, as if no one was waiting for her. Stretching her hand forward, the lady muttered that she must have looked rather funny with that pose, as if she were trying to find something in the dark, and perhaps her actions seemed strange to anyone who might have been watching from the outside. Everything would have been completely different if it weren't for the promise she once made, and the dragon's paw, which became living proof of it, symbolizing her determination and the inevitability of what she must do despite all the consequences. Then, if it weren't for that oath, she would have burned the entire village to the ground, engulfing it in flames, and would have taken her stone, ignoring the fear and destruction, because for her it would have been justice. She was tormented by the question of where the thief who had stolen her precious thing was hiding, and every moment of waiting brought only growing irritation and the desire to find him in order to return what rightfully belonged to her. The lady was ready to pay any price to get back what she had lost, and her look, blazing with rage, betrayed all her determination, because she knew that not finding the thief was worse for her than any trials she could go through. Somewhere here, there should have been an old man smiling his kind, soothing smile, and a butler who should have greeted the guest with due respect and attention, as is proper in such cases. The girl's bare, thin, menacing feet stopped in place when she felt it was time to pause, as if something in that place demanded her full attention and caution. In the distance across the semi-dark space, a door was slightly open, behind which a light burned brightly, like a beacon in the night, attracting her gaze, and promising the solution to those secrets that were hidden in this foggy silence. The maiden immediately headed towards the source of light, and stretching out her hand, carefully opened the door, as if afraid to disturb the peace of this place, but also wanting to find out what was hidden behind this threshold. There, in the room ahead, stood an altar surrounded by majestic architecture, and behind it, on his knees, a man was praying, completely absorbed in his prayer, as if not noticing her presence in this sacred place. The lady's red eyes settled on him, studying him carefully and intently, as if trying to read his every thought, every movement, until her gaze lingered on his face, trying to understand who he was and what he was hiding. It was Cain, who, with his hands folded together, continued to sit in complete silence, absorbed in his thoughts, and not expecting any intervention at that moment, as if the whole world remained outside his attention. Hearing footsteps and feeling a presence, he suddenly turned around, meeting the gaze with surprise, as he did not expect a visit to this secluded corner where no one should disturb him. Astonished Cain, not having time to really understand what was happening, began to ask questions, trying to understand who had become his guest, but suddenly stopped frozen, as if something important in this moment made him silent. In shock, his hand accidentally caught the candelabra, and the candle with its blazing flame tilted awkwardly, causing it to begin to fall, creating a dangerous moment that could have ended in disaster. Cain quickly rose to his feet, managing to react, but the candlestick was already lying nearby, having fallen loudly to the floor, and the sounds of the fall echoed in the silence of the room, filling it with tension and anxiety. The guy was in complete shock. His mouth was wide open, and his eyes wide with surprise, as if he couldn't believe what was happening in front of his eyes, and his body seemed to not obey him, freezing in anticipation for the situation to become clear. Celicia finally pulled her hood down, revealing her face, and a sly smile spread across her lips, as she said, laughing slightly, that she must have come to the right place, as if everything that was happening was predictable and carefully planned in advance. Without wasting any time, the guy hurried towards the mysterious woman, his steps becoming faster and more confident, his gaze never leaving her figure, and each of his steps seemed more decisive, as if he could not afford to miss a single moment. The man's hand was extended towards her in an attempt to get closer to her, as if his consciousness did not allow him to sit still, and the desire to touch her was so strong that his hand, without thinking, reached out to her with involuntary determination. With disbelief and a slight trepidation in his movements, Cain carefully touched the girl, as if not believing that everything that was happening was reality, and noticing her surprised look, he also froze, not expecting that her reaction would be the same as his own feelings. The light streaming from the windows softly illuminated the room, and the bars on the window, as if frozen in place, could not hide all the beauty of this night glow, which filled the atmosphere with a mysterious and enigmatic light. Hugging his mistress close, the butler whispered, with deep relief, that he was glad of her return, because this long-awaited event gave him a feeling of peace, as if all his problems were finally behind him. Suddenly, Celicia pulled away from the man, as if she didn't recognize him. Her gaze became cold and alien, and she pushed him away from her, as if he was not at all what she expected to see, and her behavior surprised the butler himself. In a serious and slightly rude tone, she said that perhaps they should have postponed this happy reunion, as she had much more important matters to attend to right now that required her immediate attention and concentration. Smiling, but with a slight hint of sadness on her lips, she placed her hand on her heart and explained that she had lost her memory, as if trying to justify her coldness and explain why her feelings and actions had changed. The guy's face froze in amazement. He couldn't believe what he heard, and his eyes reflected complete shock, as if Celicia's words were something incredible that didn't fit into the reality of his perception. Cain was a loyal butler to his mistress, working in her mansion for a long time, with devotion, expecting nothing in return. And his debt to her was the main guideline in life, allowing him to accumulate the knowledge and memories he wanted to return to her. To restore her memory and help her recover her lost past, he decided to take her to memorable places, hoping that familiar sights and atmosphere would stimulate memories. But as it turned out, the library and his office were alien to the lady. The streets, the courtyard, even the places where she had once walked and felt at home were now completely unfamiliar to her, and she could not remember anything that had once been so familiar, as if her life was still covered in the darkness of forgotten memories. Moreover, Celicia realized that this handsome young man standing in front of her was not at all like the old man she had imagined in her fantasies, because she was able to imagine a completely different picture. And now this young man surprised her with a smile. With her hands out to the side as if pointing at everything around her, she declared with determination that based on the story, she had a rough idea of what kind of person he was. But that was not enough to fully reconstruct the picture of what had happened in his life before. Opening her eyes, Celicia added that despite everything that had been said, they still had many important things to discuss, and her words sounded with a slight hint that questions about her past were still unresolved. The woman's bare feet remained motionless in place, but soon they turned smoothly, and the movements became so graceful that it immediately attracted attention, as if grace itself was manifested in every step she took, despite all the strangeness of the moment. With interest and slight surprise, she asked the guy why he stayed in this house, why he didn't leave, because it would seem everything had lost its meaning, and leaving could have been a logical step for anyone who was not connected to this place. Bowing his head, Cain paused for a moment, as if processing her question, and without giving himself time to think, he briefly replied that he was her servant, her butler, and could not leave his mistress even in the event of her death, since this was his destiny. He had no ulterior motives or other reasons for staying here, only devotion to his duty, and it seemed like his decision was absolutely logical for him, despite all the difficulties he might experience. High ceilings adorned with magnificent chandeliers hung from the darkness, their expensive crystals reflecting the faint light, creating an atmosphere of luxury and mystery in the room, as if the house itself was a living witness to all these untold stories. With a mocking and sly smile, Celicia asked if Cain would continue to serve her, even though she did not remember anything from her past, and might not act like a true mistress since her behavior might have changed. The butler, taking a step forward, approached her, and looking into her eyes with complete confidence, firmly declared that he could never leave his mistress despite all the circumstances, because his devotion and duty to her were unchanging. Having tenderly kissed the beauty's hand, the guy confirmed his loyalty only to her, leaving no doubt that his affection for her and service were stronger than any changes that could happen in her life. The library they entered was spacious and majestic, its walls lined with rare and valuable books, giving the place a special atmosphere, as if it were a treasury of knowledge and wisdom of an ancient family. Cain, noticing Celicia's gaze, explained that the presence of such a library meant not only culture and knowledge, but also power, the strength of the family, which was passed down from generation to generation, giving the owners of this land a special place in society. Casting a glance at the shelves filled with volumes containing many rare books, the lady thought to herself that power itself had no meaning for her, since her aspirations and interests in life were far from the values she saw in this house. Thoughtfully, with a slight interest, Celicia extended her hand upward, running her fingers over the objects that caught her attention, as if trying to find among them something that could awaken forgotten memories or arouse her curiosity. One book in particular caught her attention, and her feminine hand instantly grabbed it by the spine, pulling it off the shelf, feeling like an explorer ready to uncover the secrets hidden within the pages of this ancient tome. Cain, noticing her difficulty, approached her and helped her get the book, arguing that his help was due to the fact that it was too high up, and that without his help, it would be difficult to get the volume, especially considering her current condition. Celicia, agreeing with his words, asked him to explain other details and the meaning of those books in order to better navigate this world and feel confident in the future, no matter how complex her memories were. The boy, smiling, began to explain where the books on discipline, etiquette, and manners were trying to give her knowledge that could be useful in life, despite her memory loss, and to show her how to navigate this house full of ancient secrets. Quietly, with an expression of surprise, Celicia marveled at the scale of the library, for she had never seen such a large collection of books before, and her gaze lingered on each shelf as if trying to comprehend the grandeur of this place. Suddenly, her finger pointed to the side, and with interest she asked the butler what was in that corner of the library, where a bright light was burning among the shelves, attracting her attention as something unusual and important. There was indeed a bright light shining in that part of the room, surrounded by many books, creating an atmosphere of mystery and intrigue, which made Celicia even more interested in this mysterious corner. With a smile, as if anticipating her question, Cain explained that there were educational literature study materials that could help her restore knowledge if she wanted to return to studying something from her past. However, adding in a soft tone, he advised her not to rush, but rather to rest and get used to the environment, since she was just beginning to realize that there was a lot that was new and important for her here, and rushing would not be the best idea. Celicia continued reading the book, saying out loud that because she had forgotten so much, she would have to relearn and remember many things as if she were returning to the past, which was now a mystery to her that needed to be solved. Having finished looking around the mansion and lost in thoughts about her surroundings, the girl asked the butler, who had been next to her before, among the people who surrounded her, since the memories of them seemed to have been lost. The book was carefully placed back where it came from, but Celicia's mind was filled with questions about her past and who could help her regain her lost memories. Suddenly, Celicia froze, surprised to realize that the most appropriate place to meet other people might be a banquet, where those who could help her find answers to her questions would gather. She thought that at such an event, it was quite possible that the very thief who stole her magic stone would be there, and she did not rule out that this could be her chance to get it back. Cain, not sharing her confidence, doubted that aristocrats would appear at the banquet, which aroused the beauty's interest, since her intuition told her that the event would be more significant than he had expected. Fierce fighting continued on the border, never ceasing for a moment. The ground echoed with distant explosions, and the air was filled with the roar of weapons and the cries of soldiers fighting for every inch of land. Snowstorms and heavy blizzards continued to hinder the journey, as if nature itself was trying to stop their progress, adding even more difficulties to a path that seemed endless. Putting her hand to her chin, Celicia said thoughtfully that under these circumstances, they would have to organize a banquet in the near future, although perhaps not immediately, since the circumstances required patience and preparation. The butler readily reported that he had prepared a bath for the lady in advance, as if he had foreseen her fatigue and need for rest after a hard day. She could not refuse the comfort that was already there, because her body was exhausted, and the thought of hot water seemed like a salvation that promised her long-awaited relaxation and peace. The books left unattended were scattered across the floor in complete disarray, creating a sense of chaos that seemed to reflect the girl's inner state. The man, noticing the disorder, apologized for his confusion, and then bent down to pick up the fallen book, trying to restore order and avoid further inconvenience to his mistress. With a smile filled with concern, Cain reminded the lady that the water in the bath could have cooled down, and advised her to hurry to the bathroom so as not to miss the chance to enjoy a warm rest, which was so necessary after long worries. The maiden slowly followed the servant, leaving the book open on the stand, where the pages depicted a castle surrounded by majestic nature, which seemed eternal and endless. The statues, majestic and monumental, depicted griffins with outstretched wings. Their stone figures seemed to guard a room filled with history and mystery that this ancient mansion hid. On the table, decorated with antique carvings, stood a tray on which rested an elegant box containing bath accessories and bottles of fragrances that created an atmosphere of peace and comfort. Celicia sank into the warm water with pleasure, letting it wrap around her body like a soft cocoon and carry away the heaviness that had accumulated over the long days, giving rest to her tired body. Carefully, with concern for her feelings, she raised her head, her gaze directed into emptiness, and quietly whispering, she felt how the fatigue slowly disappeared, and her body was filled with lightness and calm, as if she had found a new charge of energy. Taking the exquisite glass in her hands, she took a light sip of the refreshing drink, enjoying its coldness and aroma, which instantly filled her body with a feeling of freshness, as if every sip was full of new life. Cain was an impeccable butler who served his mistress with such attention and devotion that his every movement, every word, was like part of the harmony that created the ideal atmosphere of comfort and well-being. In the hand of this refined beauty is the glitter of a medallion that was once stolen from her life by a thief who seemed to leave a trace of his presence, but had no idea of the meaning and value of this decoration. She looked thoughtfully at the jewel, feeling its cold metal in her hands, and despite thoughts about a possible connection with the thief, She understood that Cain was probably not the thief because he did not recognize the jewelry. However, Celicia was most likely important to someone, since that person most likely wore a medallion with her image, as if a memory of a dear person was kept in this jewelry as a symbol of something touching and personal. Hearing a strange and sharp knock, a sound that brought some anxiety into the atmosphere, the lady's eyes instantly turned to the side, trying to catch the source of this noise that disturbed her peaceful silence. The servant announced her arrival loudly, as if to remind everyone of her presence, before stepping through the door without being invited, disturbing the peace of the room with a character as insistent as her voice. The beauty sat quietly in the water, absorbed in her thoughts, when suddenly Cain entered the room, and his presence, as always, was unexpected, but no less significant for her. With a smile that could melt away any doubts, the butler announced that he had come to help the lady get rid of her fatigue, and his voice sounded so confident that it seemed he could grant instant relief. The man's hands began to roll up the sleeves of his snow-white shirt, with grace and determination, trying not to wet it. As approaching his task with ease, he prepared to offer his help at the most opportune moment. When asked if she needed anything, Celicia answered briefly and confidently that she didn't need anything. Her voice was calm and decisive, as if she didn't need anything, although there might have been another thought hidden inside. The boy washed his mistress's hands with care and complete devotion, helping her in this matter, as if every gesture of his was dictated not only by duty, but also by deep concern for her well-being. Cain thought thoughtfully that 5 years had already passed and his mistress's hair remained the same as before, undisturbed by time, and this filled him with a strange feeling, as if everything around him had remained the same. For him, time seemed to stop the moment his mistress left him. And although the world continued to spin, Cain's life only began to move on again when she returned, filling his existence with meaning. Bending down to her hair, the man said with a soft smile that he remembered everything about her, and his words were filled with such sincere affection that they seemed like a simple continuation of the time spent next to her. The guy was sitting by the water when Celicia, with interest in her voice, asked what happened after she left. And this question seemed to return them to moments when everything was simple and clear, but at the same time invariably changing. The lady firmly and decisively stated that she would definitely not ignore the disappearance of her fiancé if something similar had happened to her, because she understood how important it was not to ignore the disappearance of a loved one. Once she found herself in the middle of the events, she learned that when the beautiful babe left home, the family involved in her disappearance was severely punished, and it was quite a test for those who were involved in this tragic incident. Briefly, restrainedly, and in his own way, clearly the butler explained that those aristocrats who were somehow involved in this matter were accused of murdering a noble lady, which entailed serious consequences for their reputation and position. Celicia froze in surprise and shock, not expecting that all this time everyone thought she was dead, and her inner world was suddenly filled with anxiety and misunderstanding, because she could not imagine that her disappearance gave rise to such rumors. The candles in the bathhouse burned with a bright and warm light, their flames dancing in the air, creating an atmosphere of coziness and mystery, while the young people carried on a lively conversation, discussing the latest rumors that were so exciting the city. The girl, lost in her thoughts, believed that Celicia had simply disappeared from life, hiding from everyone, but she had no idea that her absence could be connected with something more tragic than just running away or disappearing. Suddenly, Cain blushed, feeling his gaze linger on his mistress for a moment, not expecting his attention to be so noticeable, and at that moment he felt awkward, as if his secret thoughts were being exposed to everyone around him. The guy, shyly turning away, felt how embarrassment enveloped him, and covering his face with his hands, he tried to hide his awkwardness, not knowing how to cope with the emotions that overwhelmed him at that moment. The noblewoman, feeling that she had accepted enough help, resolutely refused further assistance from the guy, with a slight hint of fatigue in her voice, declaring that she had had enough worries and interference, nothing more was required. After this, Cain, slightly lowering his head, walked away, deciding that he needed to prepare a bedroom for his mistress to create the comfort and silence that she had long dreamed of, because she deserved only the best. The aristocrat, staring at her reflection in the water, thought about how she had chosen a dead man to become him, and this realization struck her, causing her to think about her decisions and the consequences they brought. Hearing the creak, she quickly turned towards him, warily, assessing what was happening, and her gaze met with the one who stood next to her, instantly capturing her attention, as if the moment had stopped ready to reveal a new mystery. She closed her eyes in confusion and muttered something under her breath, as if praying that Cain would understand her silent order and leave her alone, as she needed some solitude to sort out her thoughts and emotions. But contrary to her expectations, instead of the butler, a dark figure in a long cloak was heading towards the beauty, and her steps sounded muffled, like a harbinger of something dangerous that was approaching with every moment. The blade, flashing for a moment, was clutched in the fingers of this figure, and it reflected the light, as if ready for action, suddenly breaking the calm and foreshadowing something ominous that was about to happen. He was a mercenary who had come with the sole purpose of ending the lady, and his swing was swift and deadly, as if time had slowed down, and his every step was filled with determination to finish the job. However, the beauty's reaction was incredibly fast. She frowned. Her instincts kicked in instantly, and she looked around, looking for ways to defend herself, ready to meet the threat face to face, despite its unexpected appearance. The woman's hand waved, and instantly, there was a fiery explosion, bright and powerful, which seemed to tear apart space, illuminating everything around, leaving behind only flames and a cloud of smoke. The failed killer lay on the ground near the column, breathing heavily and suffering from a wound in his side. His body was wounded, and his heart was still beating with each labored breath, but he knew that his chances of survival were almost zero. The girl picked up a red blanket from the floor, and the fabric slid in her hands. Her movements were smooth, and her gaze was focused, as if she was going to hide from the world, closing herself off from all threats and worries. Covering herself with a cloth, Celicia thoughtfully asked why they couldn't leave her alone, as if her voice sounded tired from the endless attacks, and she was increasingly losing patience with such encounters. In shock, the mercenary, not yet realizing what had happened, stared at the lady who was confidently walking towards him. And this sight confused him. How could such a fragile woman be so strong and confident in herself, despite her appearance? With a cold gaze that did not forgive the slightest doubt, Celicia asked who was the man who had come to assassinate her. Her voice sounding icy, as indicated by her gaze devoid of any pity. The man, overcome with panic, began to tremble. His body could not contain the fear of that determined look, and sweat, like cold drops, flowed down his face, as if he was trying to get rid of the horror that had seized him. The maiden slowly removed the mask from the mercenary's face, trying to figure out his identity, and as soon as the fabric slid off his face, she saw the face of a young man that was distorted with pain, and his eyes were full of fear and despair. In front of her stood a young man with bright red hair. His face was covered in blood, and his breathing was intermittent and heavy, as if every movement was difficult for him, and he could barely stay on his feet. Raising his head with an effort, he asked breathlessly whether the maiden was a magician, since she possessed such powerful strength, since no one except magicians could perform such miracles that he had just witnessed. With a smirk that barely hid an ironic grin, Celicia shrugged, and a flame suddenly flared up in her hand, casting shadows on the walls, as if the magic itself was emanating from her, and then asked if the mercenary knew anything about magic stones. Regular wizards couldn't perform magic without magical stones, which were the key to powerful spells and sorcery, so his answer could reveal a lot about his knowledge and goals. Who was this mysterious beauty who handled magic so easily and confidently, as if it was a simple task, for her being only a simple aristocrat? The fire in the noblewoman's hand was burning brightly, its flames dancing in her palm, but she stood as calmly as if it was something ordinary, feeling neither fear nor excitement, and her smile remained warm and mysterious, as if she was in complete control of the situation. The mercenary, despite all the pain, still clutched the blade in his hand, his fingers wrapped around the hilt as if they couldn't part with the weapon, despite all the chaos that was happening around him. And he continued to stand, as if it was the last thing keeping him on his feet. Suddenly, unable to bear the pain, the man screamed, his voice full of agony, as his hand, the one that had previously held the weapon tightly, suddenly shook with sharp pain, making him realize how quickly his body was losing control, even with all his determination. And with that cry of pain, the blade was thrown back, with such force that it fell to the floor with a crash, leaving on its metal blade only a memory of what had once served as its weapon. But now it had become only a helpless weight, so as not to cause any more harm to anyone. Like a true demon? Celicia asked again, with icy calm, trying to find out who this stranger was, but feeling that further questioning would only complicate the situation. She decided not to waste any more time on questions. The man, trying his best to hold back a groan, remained stubbornly silent. His breathing was heavy, and his mouth remained open in pain, as if every inspiration required a lot of effort from him, and his body was beyond control. A moment later, the mercenary bowed his head with difficulty. His body trembled, and it seemed that he was almost losing consciousness, as if his strength was draining with each new breath, and the world around him was becoming more and more blurry and foggy. Celicia leaned towards him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder, surprised at how quickly he could get hurt from such a light blow, as if his body was not at all prepared for such an impact, which made her wonder about his real capabilities. At this point, the killer, not wanting to let the lady relax quietly and quickly, grabbed the knife again, distracting her attention, trying to escape from his weakened grip, hoping that his next move would be more successful. With a loud cry, the man rushed into the attack again, hoping to hit the noblewoman. His movements were quick and decisive, and the fury in his eyes reflected all his desperate determination despite the pain and weakened state. But suddenly, Cain, who was standing nearby, froze as if something had alarmed him, and he felt as if something terrible had happened to his mistress. An inner sense of danger made him stop in his tracks, and his heart sank with anxiety. At that moment, a sharp sound was heard in the room, and the vase standing on the table broke, scattering into hundreds of small fragments, which scattered across the floor with a dull ringing sound, filling the atmosphere with crackling and alarm. The butler bent down and began to carefully pick up the broken glass, his movements precise and quick, like a man accustomed to such tasks. But there was a restless worry in his eyes, as if he were trying to keep his own feelings under control. Mind flashed back to his mistress's words earlier, when she had admitted to having lost her memory, and the memory further increased his anxiety, making him wonder if that loss could be related to what was happening now. With sadness in his eyes, Cain looked down, feeling how heavy his heart was from the fact that his mistress did not remember him, as if the years spent together had disappeared, leaving only an emptiness between them, an inexpressible pain and alienation. Rising abruptly to his feet, he pulled himself away from his dark thoughts, with difficulty deciding that it was not worth remaining in this state, and gathered all his will to continue to perform his duties despite the pain in his soul. The servant, directing his step towards the balcony, thought of only one thing. The main thing was that his mistress had returned, despite the loss of memory, which was the most important and valuable thing for him in this world. His joy for her return could not be overshadowed by anything. He gently pressed the door handle with his hand, opening the door that led to the balcony, freeing the room from the oppressive air, and allowed himself to rest a little, enjoying the silence and freshness of the night. The starry night stretched out before him, and the clouds, like soft canvases, glided beautifully across the sky, creating a truly mesmerizing and peaceful landscape, as if nature itself was trying to distract him from his disturbing thoughts. Cain stood staring at the dark sky, his gaze focused, and thoughts like shadows pulled him into the past, where unrequited feelings for a lady reigned, which filled his heart with pain like a boundless ocean, giving him no peace. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to something in the distance below, where shadows and light played bizarre dances, and something unusual made him concentrate, as if an unknown force directed his gaze in the direction where something was happening, promising new secrets and mysteries. Among the walls of the palace in the darkness, a mysterious figure in a cloak hid, as if hiding from all eyes. It dissolved into the shadows, remaining invisible to all who did not know what to look for, and did not realize the threat creeping up on them. Cain, leaning on the balcony railing, tried to make out the stranger, who like a shadow had entered their house, breaking the silence of the night. He felt anxiety growing in his chest, and every breath he took was full of uncertainty, because this figure was alien and dangerous. Under the butler's bare feet, on the cold stone floor, lay blood, bright drops contrasting with the darkness of the night, as a reminder of what had happened, that the killer was nearby, and was now not hiding, but merely waiting for the moment to attack. The assassin gritted his teeth in irritation, realizing that the noblewoman had miraculously managed to dodge the blow, and although his actions were quick and precise, he had failed to hit his target, which only increased his anger and frustration. The beauty's eye was wounded, but despite the pain, she opened it with effort, and looking at the attacker said with a threat that the man would not leave here alive. Her voice was full of confidence, and her look promised inexorable revenge. The mercenary was amazed at the speed of her healing. His heart froze in horror, because he could not understand how this fragile woman was able to recover so quickly, and his fear only increased when he realized that he was faced with something much more dangerous than he expected. With a sly smile on her lips, the lady slowly approached the guy, and looking closely at his face, quietly whispered, realizing that he really believed that with such a light and almost imperceptible blow, he would be able to kill the dragon. The next moment, before he could even comprehend what had happened, a sword pierced his chest, and his life was cut short in an instant, leaving only cold silence and the smell of blood. In the room filled with an uneasy silence, another man suddenly appeared, his weapon covered in blood, as if it had become an extension of the horror itself, which could not leave any doubt about his intentions. He was a handsome, powerful man with snow-white hair that seemed to be woven from the very light of the moon, and with such a serious expression on his face that it seemed he could look at the world and tear it apart with one glance. Celicia, trying to understand what had happened, began to wonder who this mysterious stranger could be, and looking at his face, she tried to remember if she had seen him before, feeling deep down that this was not a chance meeting. The knight slowly sheathed his sword, when the noblewoman, with concern in her voice, asked him if he was related to the murderer who had shocked the city with his cruel deeds. The guy, after thinking for a moment, called out the name of that girl, when suddenly their conversation was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Cain, who burst into the room, disturbing the peace with his loud presence. The knight's attention instantly turned to the butler, who was standing nearby, and he turned to the lady who was watching the proceedings warily, with a worried expression on her face. Cain, not hiding his excitement, cried out loudly, worried about the fate of his mistress, expressing horror and fear, as if his whole life depended on one look at her. The knight quickly hid his face under his hood, deciding that now was not the best time for explanations, and it seemed that his thoughts had carried him far away from this disturbing situation. While the young couple was distracted by Cain's words, the man, quickly assessing the situation, quickly rushed towards the exit, intending to escape before he was noticed. Celicia, without thinking about the consequences, rushed in pursuit, trying to catch up with the stranger, whose steps were becoming quieter and quieter, and she, despite her anxiety, continued to run, hoping not to lose sight of him in this gloomy corridor. But her drive was interrupted when a strong male hand suddenly grabbed her fragile wrist, as if trying to stop her, and Celicia felt the cold but firm grip break her drive. Cain, with a hard and impartial look, answered his mistress sternly, reminding her that before rushing off in pursuit or looking for answers, she should first take care of her wound, which could cause further trouble. Meanwhile, their mysterious night guest had already disappeared, leaving behind only an open window and a carelessly abandoned door, the creak of which echoed in the empty room where only silence remained. Cain looked very concerned about his mistress's health, his gaze full of worry and concern, and he couldn't help but notice how her injury might affect her ability to cope with further events. The noblewoman, turning slightly towards Cain, briefly replied that her wound had already healed, and there was no need to worry, convincing him that she was quite healthy and capable of handling the situation without anyone's help. The killer, lying unconscious on the cold stone floor, was already dead. His body covered in blood, and his scarlet hair mixing with the darkness fell to the floor, creating a tragic picture of what had just happened. The virgin, bending over the body, began to examine it carefully, sorting through the clothes in search of something that might shed light on his identity or intentions, hoping to find some clues that would help solve the mystery. Apparently, the guy with white hair and the mercenary, whose presence in this place was also mysterious, had different goals and reasons for their visit to this ominous mansion, in which every step seemed like a step into the unknown. The tall and gloomy castle, with its mighty stone towers, stood like a silent guard amidst the endless snowy expanses, as if it had survived many years and events that had left their mark on its wounded walls. Dressed in new, elegant clothes, the maiden walked along the long marble corridors of the palace, where the butler walked next to her, and they talked, discussing something important, and their conversation was filled with light laughter and quiet excitement. In her soul, the beauty wondered who that mysterious stranger was, who on that terrible night stopped the killer as if interfering with fate, and left behind only questions that haunted her mind. Cain, tilting his head to the side, noticed in amazement that all the wounds, as if by magic, had healed so quickly, and this sight amazed him because it was so unexpected that it seemed as if the world around him had changed. Celicia, whose long hair was decorated with fresh flowers, confidently repeated that she had healed herself with magic. But suddenly, as if realizing something important, she stopped herself as if she felt that her words were not entirely true. The girl, embarrassed by her words, began to change the truth, claiming that she drank a magic potion that supposedly helped her, although in fact, she knew perfectly well that this was far from reality and hid her true feelings. The butler, holding back his gaze and not betraying any doubts, pretended to believe his mistress, although his inner feelings told him otherwise, and he remained silent, preferring not to question her words. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, another voice was heard loudly and insistently, calling for the lady's companion, its sounds echoing in the corridor, breaking the silence, and attracting the attention of everyone around. When the hostess asked who had come to see them so early, Cain replied that it was he himself, noting with surprise how unexpected and probably important for them was the appearance of this guest at such an early hour at which peace and quiet usually still reign. The visitor turned out to be Mr. Becker, a middle-aged man with distinct wrinkles on his face, and his dark short hair with sparse gaps between the strands created a striking contrast to his confident, almost imposing appearance as he waved his hand in greeting. Putting his arm around the butler's shoulders, Mr. Becker began to mutter with noticeable sincerity something about his friend, whom he had not seen since their last meeting, sadly recalling how all traces of that friendship had disappeared, and how much he had experienced the loss of the man. Finally, Mr. Becker looked up from his memories and noticed the young lady standing nearby, seemingly oblivious to everything that was happening around her, and his eyes suddenly lit up as he realized that she was now part of this moment. With a smile on his face, the man approached the lady, happy about the meeting that he had long predicted as impossible. He had once thought that he would never be able to see this face again, full of energy, and so close to him in spirit, but fate, as always, made its own adjustments. His hand squeezing the woman's hand greeted her in a friendly, almost tender manner, as if he felt that this meeting was not just an accident, but something more that united their destinies at this moment, when words seemed to lose all meaning. Celicia thought absently that this man was probably one of her acquaintances from the past, whose face, although blurred in memory, still remained an important element of her long-standing memories. Sweating, Cain muttered that Becker and his wife had once run a grocery store, a place where there was a lot of hustle and bustle and daily worries that they tried hard to keep under control. Celicia immediately realized that her assistant was helping her, while Mr. Becker, forgetting about everything, began to complain about how much he missed the young lady, remembering her with longing. The walls of the palace, imbued with an atmosphere of mourning silence and grandeur, created the feeling that time flowed slowly here, as if absorbed by the grandeur of ancient frescoes. Celicia immediately started asking about the upcoming festival that was supposed to take place very soon, showing a keen interest in the details of the event, trying to understand how it would be organized and what to expect from this event. Becker, waving his arms excitedly, announced that the Crown Prince would soon be returning to the capital after his victory on the border, and that this moment would be marked by a great celebration, which attracted the attention of all present. Celicia, interested, quickly asked if all the city's residents were going to attend the celebration, and received a confident answer that most would undoubtedly be there, anticipating this significant event. Celicia smiled, thinking that such an important event, the butlers and all of them, certainly could not miss, and turning to the butler, easily expressed her opinion about participating. The butler, having no other choice, only nodded in agreement, unable to object to her decision, which was quite logical and in line with current events. The village continued to live its normal life. People slowly moved about their business, went into houses, discussed the news, and in their daily bustle, there were no traces of the upcoming celebration or excitement. Becker, proudly leading the lady through the market, began to shout loudly and confidently so that everyone would pay attention to her presence, thereby demonstrating how important this moment was for him and his companion. The butler stood nearby as the gentleman added that Celicia had come to the market with the aim of helping all the locals, offering her help and support, which was attracting more and more interest from those around her. When the crowd noticed the lady previously believed to be dead by rumors, they began to whisper in surprise and shock, not believing their eyes, discussing this incredible meeting as if a ghost from the past was standing before them. People began to ask the lady where she had been all this time and why her appearance had not changed, trying to find out how it happened that she had returned without undergoing any changes. Seeking help, Celicia quietly approached the butler, asking him to help her get rid of the noisy and persistent peasants who would not stop asking questions and were too intrusive about her past. However, Cain was completely absorbed in the attention of the girl who grabbed his hand and began to persistently pester him, showing obvious interest in his appearance and manners. Before leaving with the girls, Cain promised that he would return very soon and would definitely help the lady, not forgetting about his obligations, despite the situation that was developing around him. Suddenly, someone's hands grabbed the beauty by the elbow, attracting her attention and making her turn, instantly feeling how the force of this gesture conveyed the urgency of the situation and awakened her curiosity about what was happening. It was a young girl who asked the noblewoman to follow her in a light and confident tone, and her request sounded as if she knew perfectly well that Celicia was the one who could help in what awaited her. Before Celicia had time to realize what was happening, the girl had already begun to pull her forward, leading her through the crowd with such ardor and determination that the aristocrat herself barely had time to follow her, losing any opportunity to object. There was a bustle around the small pond, surrounded by green grass and wicker baskets, where the villagers usually washed their clothes. Their everyday life seemed completely alien to her, but at the same time, it was full of some deep reality. The aristocrat, looking at what was happening, felt obvious discontent and confusion from the fact that she was being forced to help in such an occupation which she had never considered her business, and that her high position did not protect her from this awkward situation. Ordinary people, many of whom were poor and barely making ends meet, did this work every day, carrying heavy piles of clothes, washing them in water to provide for their families, without having the opportunity to relax for a minute. Suddenly, the young maiden with a curious look asked the beauty if she was waiting for the very one, to which Celicia could not immediately answer, because her thoughts were occupied with other concerns, and she did not immediately understand what was being discussed. It turned out that the village woman had in mind a meeting with the crown prince, a handsome man who was considered the most attractive man in the entire empire, and rumors about him as a warrior who heralded victories quickly spread among the common people. The prince was a warrior who always returned victorious in shining armor, which gave him even greater charisma and respect among the people, and his appearance left no one indifferent, becoming a symbol of heroism and courage. Clutching her things to herself, the girl began to tell rumors that Edgar, despite the fact that it was believed that the noblewoman had died, still continued to wait for her return, promising that he would be incredibly glad to see her again and meet again. Silently and without any emotion, Celicia listened to the speech of ordinary villagers, who, despite their simplicity, were full of confidence in their words, sincerely believing in these rumors, even if they were far from the truth. When asked whether she would become the crown princess, the lady answered indifferently, showing neither joy nor anxiety, saying that she herself did not yet know what awaited her, and the future remained a mystery to her as it was to everyone around her. Suddenly, accidentally cutting her finger, Celicia felt a sharp pain, and blood immediately flowed from the wound, which instantly attracted the attention of those around her, and made her stop, realizing that she needed to act quickly. The hands grabbed the lady's hand, warning that if she didn't hurry and heal the wound, there would be a scar on her finger that would remind her of this moment for a long time, and it needed to be treated urgently. However, before the girl could help, she was pushed aside, and someone else took over, wanting to help quickly, without waiting for full intervention, making Celicia feel helpless at that moment. However, the maiden stubbornly grabbed a piece of cloth and, despite possible obstacles, began to bandage the wound on the lady's finger, trying to prevent trouble from happening and quickly provide the necessary assistance. Celicia just stared at the bandages wrapped around her arm, thinking only about how noisy and troublesome these people were, who seemed unable to live a peaceful life without interfering in her personal affairs. Evening was approaching, and the sun was slowly setting, illuminating the village with a golden light that softly diffused through the streets and houses, creating an atmosphere of a quiet and peaceful end of the day when everything seemed to be immersed in silence. On the table before them was a modest meal, a simple stew and fresh rolls that might have seemed plain if they had not been so tasty and nutritious, filling everyone at the table with a sense of satisfaction and homeliness. Sitting at the table with the peasants, Celicia watched as the villagers thanked the rich for their help for their good deeds, and then, as if by intuition, the conversation suddenly turned to the topic of goblins, which at first seemed strange, but soon became a topic for discussion. The noblewoman was shocked to hear that it was not rats that had appeared in the village, as she had expected, but goblins, creatures that it would seem could only be part of scary stories, but now became a real threat to these people. Cain, sitting next to her, extended his hand to the side, pointing to the lady's finger, which was bandaged and clearly injured, and his gesture was so insistent that Celicia couldn't help but notice how his gaze caught on her injured hand. Annoyed and with some slight determination, Celicia pushed the palace servant away, pulling his hand towards herself, and continuing to ask about the monsters, feeling that the question of goblins had become something more important to her than just a random rumor. Lately, the monsters had been coming down from the mountain more and more often, and people were beginning to worry that their appearance was no longer a coincidence. It was becoming a real threat to the village, and perhaps they all had to do something to prevent a catastrophe. Celicia ate her food calmly, listening to how Cain helped ordinary people, and how with his help it became easier to deal with monsters, which seemed to give confidence to the locals and raise morale. After taking just one bite, the lady couldn't help but smile with satisfaction. The dish was so delicious that she could hardly believe that such a simple village could cook so exquisitely. The man's hand extended another plate, inviting the beauty to continue her meal, and her gaze stopped on this gesture, which seemed so casual and attentive, as if Cain himself wanted to make sure that she got everything she needed. Cain, noticing her admiration, suggested that the hostess try this dish, which in his opinion was no less delicious than what she had already tried, assuring her that it was worth attention and would definitely please her. Celicia thanked her servant and explained that if people try to drive away the goblins with simple weapons, the monsters will definitely return, because such a force as magic is necessary to fight such creatures in order to achieve results. The noblewoman froze in shock, not even having time to bite her food, hearing that Cain could also use magic, and this was a complete surprise to her, because she never suspected that her faithful servant was hiding such abilities. The man lowered his head and awkwardly admitted that he could only do a few simple tricks that would hardly impress a real magician, but which were useful in everyday life to cope with difficulties. The villagers, intrigued by this revelation, began to ask the boy where he had learned witchcraft, not hiding their curiosity, since magic was rare in these places, and they wanted to know more about how a man like him could master such knowledge. To which the butler only laughed, but nevertheless noted that very few people were capable of using magic, and that even in his native lands, magical abilities were a great rare gift that only a select few possessed. Becker breathed a sigh of relief when he learned that the goblins would not appear again, as they were strong people, and the winter would soon end, which gave him confidence that the situation would soon improve. Under Madame's gaze, Cain said that he would always be ready to help the villagers, as long as they told him what they needed, and his words sounded sincere, leaving the impression that he was truly willing to support. The peasants were pleased and happy with this answer. Their faces lit up with gratitude, and they felt that their problems would not be ignored, and that help would be provided. Noticing the sadness in the madame's eyes, Becker handed her the dish offering to try it, and with this gesture, he truly struck the woman, making her feel the care and attention that she so needed. The lady smiled, and with a look of complete satisfaction, said that she was already full, but the guy apparently should eat more, because he clearly had not gained enough strength to feel completely full. Outside the window, the snow squall continued, which combined with the icy wind created a truly magical atmosphere, when white flakes inexorably filled the space, turning the world into a foggy and frozen place. Soon, a real snowstorm broke out during the night, and the house, standing far from everyone, seemed to become the only shelter in this icy world, while the blizzard raged, filling the space with cold and relentless wind. Becker offered to let the young men stay with them for the night, as the weather outside was so terrible that it would be extremely unwise and dangerous to continue on their way, and he readily offered them a place to stay for the night to ensure their safety. After he made the offer, Becker added that he would be happy to give them a ride home in the morning, when the storm might have died down and the weather would be a little calmer, which would relieve them of unnecessary worries. But Cain started in surprise and refused resolutely, and a drop of sweat ran down his face, which betrayed his inner tension despite his attempts to hide his excitement, and clearly showed that he was far from well. The girl noticed that the guy looked quite attractive, but he waved her off and said that he was fine, hiding his true feelings behind a smile, as if not wanting to show that he was not entirely comfortable. Suddenly, the man staggered and almost fell, and Celicia, noticing his weakness, immediately began to worry about him feeling uneasy, because she could not remain indifferent when something wrong happened to him. The butler's vision began to blur, and his body lost strength. He literally sank into a fog, losing consciousness more and more often, which became more and more obvious, and every moment became more dangerous for his health. Brushing his hair away from his face with his hand, the man suddenly came to his senses after he had passed out his vision, quickly clearing up, but his mind remained in a state of disquiet, not understanding what exactly had happened to him. Remembering that the mistress had arrived to see him yesterday, Cain instantly jumped out of bed, panicking and starting to look for her, worrying about where she could have disappeared to, because in such a state, he could not leave her unattended. He hurried down the steps on bare feet, trying not to waste time, because every second was worth its weight in gold, and his haste was caused by fear and the desire to find the lady as soon as possible and make sure that everything was okay with her. However, despite the fact that the chandeliers were burning in the house, the rooms remained empty, and despite the visible atmosphere of coziness and warmth, people were nowhere to be seen, which created a strange feeling of loneliness and silence in this house. The door was locked with a strong lock, and it was impossible to open it without a key, which only increased his anxiety and made him feel that the solution to the problem would not be so simple. Suddenly, to his surprise, a hand appeared that opened the door without difficulty, and the man calmly entering as if he knew that the door should open without wasting time on unnecessary thoughts. It was Celicia, who, having received a sharp blow against the doorway, suddenly lost her balance, and clutching her head, began to indignantly curse her butler, who in her opinion should have been more attentive. The guy, noticing her condition, placed his hand on Celicia's palm, gently asking how she was feeling, showing care and tenderness in this gesture, trying to make sure that she was okay after the unexpected fall. Cain tenderly apologized to the hostess, admitting that he had been too rude and had not noticed her, and with sincere regret added that his behavior was unacceptable because she deserved only respect and attention. The lady pushed away the helping hand, replying reservedly that she did not need support, and then asked how the servant was feeling, with obvious interest and slight concern, trying to find out if everything was all right with him. Once safe, Celicia let out a calm sigh of relief that everything was fine, and glad that Cain hadn't noticed her use of healing magic. She was relieved that it had gone unnoticed. It was already late, and a blizzard with a strong wind was raging outside the window, and the snow covering the ground inexorably continued its path, creating a frozen world that was permeated with cold and foggy emptiness. Turning away, the beauty suggested that the butler go up to the second floor, where they could rest and warm up, giving him the opportunity to relax a little in solitude and enjoy the silence of this comfort. A hot drink appeared in the lady's hands, smelling pleasantly of spices, which was obviously prepared to warm her and give her pleasure, filling the room with a pleasant aroma and an atmosphere of comfort. Cain, with concentration and respect, carefully wiped the feet of the woman with a rag, who had been missing somewhere all this time, perhaps walking barefoot on the cold ground, and now finally finding herself indoors, was enjoying its warmth and comfort. Celicia, having settled down on the bed, was surprised to say that she had seen snow for the first time in her life, and now she was especially interested in observing this white miracle of nature, which she had only heard about before, but had never felt on herself. Previously, she had only been in places full of destruction stones and fire, where chaos and disaster reigned, and for her this was a familiar background of life. But the snow, with its peaceful and tranquil beauty, turned out to be something completely new and unusual for her. But suddenly, with mild interest, the aristocrat changed the subject and asked the butler where he had learned magic, curious about what secrets he was hiding, since his knowledge seemed strange and unusual to her for a man of his position. With a sly grin on his face, Cain reminded that he had only mastered the basics of witchcraft without claiming any special knowledge or abilities, and added that his magical skills were far from outstanding, but only simple and limited. These were mainly staves with magic stones, or healing potions, that he used in his practice, because his knowledge of magic was limited to such simple and useful things accessible to most. The beauty blinked sleepily, and unable to fight off fatigue, began to doze off to the monotonous speech of her devoted servant, whose voice became more and more relaxing and lulling, as if plunging her into a world of half-sleep. Cain, looking at the sleeping lady, noticed how a light blush appeared on her cheeks, giving her face a special softness and tenderness, and at that moment his gaze became more thoughtful, as if he wanted to remember this moment. With his hand, he carefully removed the glass from the lady's hands so that she would not accidentally spill the water, and caring for her comfort, he acted carefully so as not to disturb her peace, because it was important to him that she rest without interference. Gently smoothing his mistress's hair with his hand, he quietly wished her good dreams, allowing her to immerse herself in the world of dreams, while he himself remained nearby, feeling responsible for her safety and comfort. Hearing strange sounds coming from behind the door, Cain quickly stood up and went to check what was going on, asking if something had happened to the lady or anyone else in this house, warily assessing the situation. His hand grabbed the door handle and pulled it towards him, but unexpectedly for him, a sharp pain pierced his body, and Cain, losing his balance, fell to the floor, feeling his strength leaving him. Celicia woke up from a strange noise, and clutching her head with her hand, tried to understand what happened. Her face was distorted with anxiety, but she could not understand what exactly caused such a storm in her calm world. A threatening shadow loomed over the fallen boy, and Becker, with a cold gaze, said that he did not want to do this, but circumstances forced him to act, and now they found themselves in a dangerous and tense situation. The man held a blade with a sharp edge in his hands, and his face expressed cruelty and determination, creating an atmosphere of danger, as if he was ready for any action that might be required at that moment. Cain leaned on the table, feeling weak, and tried to stand up with difficulty, turning to his old friend, asking what he had done, and why he was acting so strangely, as if everything around him was part of some dark game. Becker rudely replied that he shouldn't have woken up after dinner, because it only complicated everything, and it would have been much better if he had stayed asleep and not interfered with what was happening, which would only have complicated the situation. Cain suggested that the man had put poison in their food, trying to understand what could have caused such aggression and strange behavior, because his intuition told him that something was fishy about these events. And as it turned out, this was true. The poison was indeed added to the food, and there was no cure for this poison. However, for some reason, Cain woke up despite the deadly effect, and this remained a mystery to himself. Becker turned out to be a brutal mercenary who was willing to sacrifice the lives of his best friend and a young lady to complete a mission, without thinking about the consequences of his actions and without showing the slightest hesitation. The butler, with his hand outstretched resolutely, protected his lady, trying to keep her behind him, so that she would remain completely safe away from danger and no threat could reach her. Suddenly, the maddened old man, whose eyes were blazing with malice, rushed towards the butler, with a blade clutched in his hand, clearly intending to deliver a fatal blow, expressing his every movement with incredible determination and fury. Without a moment's hesitation, Cain quickly moved forward, grabbed the distraught man by the waist, and using all his strength deftly threw him to the floor, averting danger and demonstrating true courage. With a deafening crash, Becker's body fell to the floor, creating the impression that the earth trembled under the weight of this fall, And for a moment, a tense, eerie silence hung in the room, as if a harbinger of new trouble. Cain, showing determination and responsibility, shouted out an order in a loud, commanding voice, addressed to the lady, insistently demanding that she immediately leave the dangerous place and save herself at any cost in order to avoid the imminent threat. Suddenly, the blade flashing in the light was thrust deep into the butler's back, piercing his shoulder blade and causing the man unbearable pain, which made him open his mouth wide in a silent scream, reflecting the horror of what was happening. Becker, gathering his remaining strength, tried to swing for the next blow, but suddenly his hand seemed to turn into a motionless stone, became paralyzed, and stopped obeying, and he froze in amazement, realizing that the magical force had completely bound his body. Cain, exhausted and worn out, collapsed face down on the cold stone floor, no longer able to stand on his feet due to the deep wounds and the loss of the last of his strength that had left him after the brutal fight. Celicia, standing motionless in a majestic pose, raised her hand high above her head, concentrating streams of magical energy that emanated from her in a powerful, furious light, illuminating everything around her and suppressing enemies with her presence. No longer able to resist the growing weakness, Cain slowly closed his eyes, surrendering to the power of darkness, and the last thing his weakening gaze managed to catch was the image of his mistress surrounded by the radiance of power. In Celicia's graceful hand, dark energy swirled and hovered, saturated with hatred and rage, like a living substance ready to unleash all its destructive power on those who dared to stand in its way. This most sinister magic enveloped the villain's hand, instantly paralyzing him and causing him to turn to stone from the unbearable pain that pierced his body like thousands of red-hot needles, depriving him of the ability to resist. Celicia, her eyes flashing with contempt, spoke words of accusation in a cold and stern voice, calling the man a worthless swindler and a pitiful scoundrel who did not deserve even the slightest manifestation of pity. After her accusatory words, she, maintaining her dignity, slowly picked up the blade from the floor, looking at the man with icy calm, and in a sharp tone asked who exactly hired him for this dirty deed. Panic and despair filled the man, his hand shaking, clutching the hem of her dress, his voice full of pleading loudly, echoing throughout the room, begging for mercy, and hoping to awaken at least a drop of mercy in Celicia. Trying to justify his actions, he admitted in a trembling voice that if he revealed the name of the person who hired him, he would inevitably doom not only himself, but also his beloved wife. Falling to his knees, he began to beg Celicia for mercy, with tears in his eyes, his voice trembling, and his words interrupted by sobs, as if he was looking for her as his last chance to save him from inevitable punishment. Suddenly, contrary to his expectations, Celicia, with a cold expression on her face, announced that she had changed her mind, and slowly approaching carefully, placed her palm on the man's head, as if preparing to deliver her final verdict. At that very moment, a scarlet drop of blood fell to the floor, with a quiet sound, followed by another symbolizing pain and suffering, and Becker himself only screamed before his strength finally left his body. Lady Celicia, icy calm, watched the mercenary's agony in silence, her gaze impassive, devoid of even a hint of pity, as if what was happening was nothing more than part of her inevitable revenge. At this time, Madame Becker, sitting nearby, held her hands tightly clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, and her expression reflected a mixture of shock and complete awareness of the inevitability of what had happened. Tears flowed freely down the cheeks of Madame Becker, who, looking at what was happening with horror, called the young lady Celicia a real demon incapable of feeling pity or compassion, accusing her of cold cruelty. Celicia's cold, emotionless demeanor, her absolute calm with which she took life without hesitation, was so eerie that it aroused in observers a mixture of horror and awe at her power. Turning her back to what was happening, Celicia muttered, with slight irritation, that her mood was completely ruined, and there was fatigue in her voice, mixed with a shadow of contempt for those around her. Warm memories of the butler, who had always been a loyal and helpful servant, suddenly flashed through her mind, and the thought that his death would be meaningless was briefly reflected in her gaze. Stopping at the man, she bowed her head, and her blood-red eyes, with wild fury and hidden pain, dug into his figure, as if wanting to convey to him the full depth of her hatred. At this time in the tavern, where many people had gathered, they were loudly discussing the latest rumors, their voices merging into a general hum, filled with assumptions and guesses about what was happening outside the walls of the estate. The men in the tavern were animatedly discussing the death of Mr. Becker and the grief of his widow, and their conversations filled the space with grim details, never ceasing to shake the air with emotion and sympathy for her loss. At one of the far tables, as if trying to remain unnoticed, sat a mysterious stranger in a dark cloak, his face hidden in the shadow of a hood and a cup, with some kind of dark drink in his hand, oblivious to his surroundings. Looking sadly into his drink, the stranger quietly muttered that no matter how much they questioned Mrs. Becker, no one was able to reveal the details of the terrible tragedy that destroyed her life and the life of her entire family. The second man sitting at the next table sadly added that Becker's widow, in addition to everything else, had also lost her memory, which unfortunately only worsened her suffering and made her condition even more difficult. The mysterious handsome man in the cloak, sitting to the side, listened with intense attention to the conversations about the aristocratic family. His gaze became increasingly gloomy, and something in his soul seemed to respond to these rumors. Unable to bear the growing excitement, he abruptly put the cup down on the table. A loud knock on the wood made everyone in the tavern turn around, and the men fell silent for a moment, looking in surprise at the stranger who seemed to know more than he could tell. The men ended the conversation by concluding that it was likely a spontaneous killing, nothing more, not worthy of in-depth investigation or further discussion. The knight in the dark cloak, leaving behind whispers and glances, rose from his place, and not paying attention to the others, walked away, his mysterious figure disappearing into the darkness. As he passed one of the gossips without warning, he gave him a sharp push, causing him to choke and start cursing speechless from the unexpected encounter with this mysterious stranger. One of the men stood up and shouted loudly at the stranger, demanding that he watch where he was going. But his voice sounded with obvious contempt, as if he was used to commanding others. The stranger, without saying a word, stopped and stared at the drunkard with a cold, icy gaze. His eyes were full of icy menace, as if ordering him to be silent and do what he was told. The frightened boy froze in place from the threat. His body seemed to have turned to stone, and the words stuck in his throat so that he could no longer say anything, feeling a cold pressure on himself. One of his friends, noticing that the situation was getting out of control, hastened to reassure him, saying that perhaps it was simply the consequences of the fact that they had drunk too much earlier, but his words could not restore confidence. The man with white hair, ignoring the frightened drunks, continued on his way, walking away a steps calm and determined, as if he was confident in his decision despite what was happening around him. There were rumors about the mysterious guy that he was a killer, and many said that it was better not to mess with him. Avoiding him was a wise decision if you did not want to become his next victim. The street was already sinking into the evening silence. The houses stood as always dark and silent, and the old boxes by the sidewalk added to the picture a feeling of abandonment, as if this corner of the city was deprived of life and hope. The peasant who had been drinking in the tavern earlier decided to go outside to get some fresh air, try to clear his head and clear his thoughts of the heavy, drunken fog that had not yet left his consciousness. However, as he stood outside enjoying the cool night air, he suddenly noticed something strange at his feet, something dark and restless that instantly caught his attention and made him wary. The man winced as he looked down in alarm to see his beaten comrade lying helpless on the ground, his body immobilized and his face covered in blood, giving the peasant a feeling of horror and helplessness. The boor who had been shouting and cursing in the building earlier was now lying unconscious. His eyes rolled back, and there was blood on his face, as if some violent struggle or violent blow had left him in that state. The loud cries of the trees and the silence of the night, filled with billions of sparkling stars, created an atmosphere in which every movement and sound seemed something unusual and disturbing, as if nature itself was watching what was happening. There was a sharp creak, and the door of the hut slowly opened as the man stepped over the threshold, his foot taking a step forward, confidently, heading into the dark space that held the unsolved mystery. Inside the hut, only traces of the crime remained: blood on the floor left by an unknown person, and not a single person, and the candles that illuminated this place went out, leaving the room in a dark shadow and complete silence. The knight entered the house, beginning to examine it for signs of flight or resistance, but everything looked strange and awkward, as if in this place there were only questions that no one could answer. He lowered his head and realized that someone was persistently following the girl, and this feeling of pursuit did not give him peace, making his heart beat faster, as if everything that was happening was part of a mysterious game. His steps stopped near a used bandage that lay on the ground, and it made him feel like the story he had been trying to unravel was only just beginning to unfold. The knight leaned over and began to carefully examine the abandoned bandage, carefully picking it up with his hand to understand what it could tell about what had happened and who had left this trace in this mysterious place. Turning away, he decided to himself that he could not allow the young noblewoman to die right here, because his duty as a protector was too important to leave her in such a state without help. In the woman's hand was a blade covered in precious stones, with a sharp edge that glowed in the dim light, giving the weapon an incredible danger and sophistication, clearly indicating its unusual belonging. Celicia thought to herself that such a weapon, with its luxurious decoration and detailed workmanship, would be too rich and ornate for a simple peasant, emphasizing that this girl was definitely not someone ordinary. As the lady sat, another man entered the room. His steps sounded firm, and he was not like the one she had seen before. His presence filled the space with an unusual feeling. It was Cain, who now looked much better after the injury he had received. The pallor had disappeared from his face, and a healthy look had returned, as if everything that had happened to him before had become just a bad memory. The man approached the lady, saying that he was completely healed, thanks to her potion, and now had no scars. His words sounded sincere, as if he was looking for a way to repay her for her help. Although the memory of the mercenary stabbing the butler in the back still remained in his mind, the scene periodically popped up in his mind, reminding him of events that could affect their future relationship. Celicia, with a soft look, asked the boy not to overexert himself, as he was still recovering, and her words sounded caring, like a reminder that a full recovery takes time and patience. Cain walked closer to the beauty, asking for forgiveness for his weakness and uselessness that he had shown earlier, his words full of remorse and a desire to atone for his guilt before her. The man's hand clenched into a fist in anger at himself, and his whole soul was engulfed in internal conflict. He could not forgive himself for the mistakes he had made, despite the fact that circumstances were sometimes not in his favor. The lady stood barefoot on the floor, ordering the butler to stop slandering her. Her voice was stern and determined, as if she was ready to fight for her honor at any cost, regardless of the circumstances. The noblewoman turned her gaze to her companion and added that the main thing was that they were alive and well. Her words sounded so calm, as if life itself could not be a more valuable and important gift than everything else. However, the butler, bowing his head, blamed himself for everything. His face expressed the deepest regret, and he could not get rid of the feeling of guilt that tormented him for every wrong word and action. Celicia placed her hand over the other man's mouth and firmly stated that Cain had done everything he could, her words sounding confident, emphasizing that she defended his actions despite any doubts from those around him. After which, the aristocrat waved her hand, and holding back her emotions, said honestly that at first she thought about running away and leaving the guy to die, but in the end, she could not overcome her own heart, unable to leave him in such a position. And so the lady, despite her fragility and weakness, was forced to drag the butler with her thin arms to save him. But he turned out to be too heavy, and every step was taken with great effort, as if the whole world was against her intentions. After that, with difficulty covering the distance, Celicia, sitting on a horse, carried them back home, with each movement her heart filled with excitement, because she was perfectly aware of the full responsibility for what was happening. The servant felt incredibly awkward. His face turned red with embarrassment, and his heart started beating faster because he didn't know how to act correctly in such a situation, getting lost in his thoughts and feeling that he didn't know at all what to do next. The beauty, tightly squeezing her hand on the balcony railing, asked him not to lead the guy on so stupidly anymore, because every word she said was full of care and concern, and her request sounded like a demand to be more careful in the future. With a smile on her lips, Celicia said that she could take care of her body herself, emphasizing her independence and confidence that she is quite capable of coping with any difficulties without needing outside help. Bowing his head respectfully, Cain promised the lady that in the future he would obey her and not act as he had before, his words full of respect and willingness to follow her instructions despite his own doubts. Suddenly, Celicia pointed to the broken part of the blade, her gaze full of worry and concentration, as she noticed that this weapon was damaged, and this detail could not be missed in such an important situation. Taking the weapon, Cain began to examine it carefully, paying special attention to every detail, and also noticed that the family crest on the blade had been deliberately destroyed, which left less and less doubt about the intention to hide his true affiliation. The aristocrat looking at the blade assumed that it was probably the work of the nobility who wanted to kill her, and her assumptions, it seems, were not random, because each event could be part of a much more complex plan. Cain muttered quietly about the family of traitors who had previously been accused of murdering a noblewoman, and his words sounded with a special tone of disappointment and condemnation, because such actions could not go without consequences. These traitors monopolized the magic stones in the northern snowy regions, seizing rare resources and growing stronger every day, which undermined the balance in the region and threatened the safety of many. After they captured the magic stones, their family became rich by folding their hands and doing nothing, which only increased their power and influence, since their entire life was built on the exploitation of resources, not on labor or effort. Their wealth was great: coins, stones, crystals. All this accumulated in their possessions, creating an atmosphere of absolute power where not a single hand works, but everyone receives their share of the captured wealth. Because of this, the status of the imperial family was shaken, and with it, the crown, which had long symbolized power and invincibility, but now could no longer hide the cracks that appeared under its weight. And so it was decided to join the hands of the two families in the marriage of the prince and the lady whose name was Celicia. This union seemed the only way to strengthen the position and return to its former strength, as well as to eliminate the threat to the dynasty. There were rumors that traitors were planning a rebellion and preparing to go into battle, and these rumors, spreading throughout all corners of the kingdom, only confirmed the fears that not everyone was happy with the current state of affairs. Eventually, Mrs. Celicia disappeared, leaving behind only flowers engulfed in blood, and her disappearance became a mystery, giving rise to much speculation about her fate and what was really behind her disappearance. Intrigued, Celicia now, in another time, asked if there were any more of the exiles left alive, those who were considered scoundrels and traitors. Her question was full of caution, because any of them could be the key to unraveling her own situation. Rumors had it that the traitor's second son had managed to escape during the battle, disappearing in the midst of the fighting, and the news quickly spread, leaving many wondering what would happen to him next, whether he was alive or had already become a victim. However, this man disappeared, and no one knew whether he was alive or dead. His fate remained a mystery, fraught with many questions, and everyone who ever knew him wondered whether he could survive or became a part of history. Cain then added that if the guy survived, he might want to meet the surviving lady who had recently returned. His words were full of concern and speculation, because it was unclear how all this would affect the future of their meeting. Celicia remembered the strange guy with gray hair, and couldn't help but wonder if he could be the second son of the traitors, because his unusual appearance and behavior seemed to indicate that he was part of this difficult story. The castle stood in the middle of empty lands, surrounded by silent trees, covered with snow, and the whole scene was full of silence and loneliness, as if time had stopped here, and life had become something distant and forgotten. The corridors in the mansion were long, and the staircases leading into the darkness seemed endless, as if they led to another dimension, where time lost its power, and every step echoed in the silence of the huge empty rooms. Cain pressed his hand to his mouth and called loudly for his mistress, his voice echoing throughout the empty castle, but in his intonation one could hear not only a request, but also anxiety, as if he had a premonition of something important and necessary. The man was dressed in a white tunic with gold jewelry, and despite his outward determination, he offered his help to the lady, but she without hesitation refused, demonstrating her independence and fortitude at that moment. The long white dress flowing across the floor seemed to be a symbol of her nobility and grandeur, and it emphasized her refined grace as she moved slowly, as if the very atmosphere around her became part of her majestic image. The noblewoman walked slowly down the stairs, also dressed in a white tunic adorned with precious stones and embroidery. Her steps were smooth, and her gaze was focused as if she already knew what awaited her ahead. Celicia was as beautiful as an ancient goddess. Her appearance radiated such indescribable harmony that anyone who saw her could not help but admire her grandeur, as if she were the embodiment of the very ideal of beauty. Standing next to the butler, she asked his opinion on how she looked, her gaze full of curiosity, and perhaps even a little shyness, waiting for a response from the man whose opinion was important to her. Cain blushed embarrassedly and pointed his finger upwards, noting that the lady was magnificent today. His words sounded with sincere admiration, because he was enchanted by her image and could not hide his admiration. Kneeling down, the man added that the skirt should have been rolled up, and noticing its potential danger, he began to help the lady, otherwise she could trip over the long hem. His caring attitude was evident in every gesture. Celicia laughed at this action, complimenting the guy that he looked good too. Her laughter was light and gentle, as if this situation was another reason to enjoy the moment. The noblewoman hurried her companion, saying that they might be late for the banquet. Her words were full of haste, but there was a softness in her voice, as if she were trying to speed up her steps and maintain elegance at the same time. Suddenly, Cain leaned slightly and kissed his mistress's hand. Calling her princess, his gesture was unexpected, but full of respect, as if he wanted to express his devotion and admiration for her greatness. Annoyed by the stupid joke, Celicia nudged her companion in the shoulder, pushing him away, her gaze full of displeasure, as if this act was too vulgar for her high standards. The village was preparing for the holiday. The houses were decorated, and in the center stood a large church, and the whole atmosphere was filled with a sense of anticipation and joy, creating an atmosphere of upcoming fun. The villagers tended to the flowers, and everyone was dressed up, their clothes, reflecting the joy of the occasion, and the care they took in every element of their surroundings emphasized the importance of the upcoming celebration and unity. The noblewoman looked at the locals with amazement, amazed by their costumes and pleasant atmosphere. Her eyes sparkled with surprise, because she had never seen such sincere joy and simplicity filled with life. Cain walked behind and asked the lady to be careful, as it was easy to get lost in the crowd. His voice was soft, but there was a sense of concern in it, as if he was trying to keep his lady safe in this festive chaos. Celicia waved it off, saying that the butler was too worried, and she continued to carefully examine the goods in the market, enjoying the bright colors and lively atmosphere that reigned around. Her gaze was caught by the jewelry. Many pairs of earrings encrusted with beautiful precious stones, which sparkled in the sun, attracting attention with their refined luxury. She grabbed one of the jewels with her hand, wanting to examine it better, her fingers gliding lightly over the smooth surface, enjoying the sensation that these magnificent pieces brought. Suddenly, with a smile on her face, Celicia offered the guy to try on one of the earrings. Her gaze was playful, and there was a cheerful curiosity in her voice, as if it was a joke that would make him step out of his usual role a little. Cain looked at his ears with the new decoration in the mirror, embarrassed, his face red with embarrassment, and his expression showing how he was trying to figure out how good the decoration would look. The man blushed and said shyly that the jewelry looked too provocative on him. His words were quiet, and his gaze avoided his reflection in the mirror, as if he couldn't believe he had risked wearing something so conspicuous. The lady firmly said that the jewelry suited him, and she herself, already holding food in her hand, looked confident and calm, as if her words were an obvious statement for her not subject to doubt. At the rumors of the dragon, the lady began to cough loudly, choking. Her face instantly turned pale, and her throat became dry when she accidentally heard about such a terrible creature that could threaten their peaceful life. She noticed the villagers were discussing that a dragon, a great monster, had wandered into their land recently and was hiding among them. Its presence could be felt, but no one could say exactly where it was hiding. The girls insisted that the monster would have been discovered long ago, but apparently the monster was cunning. Its stealth and clever maneuvers allowed it to remain unnoticed among the crowd. although everyone knew that the danger was real. If you think about it, the monsters appeared in close connection with the dragon, which Becker mentioned at dinner. His words did not give her peace, and the lady began to understand that this threat could be much more serious than they could imagine. The noblewoman looked around in search of her butler, but he had already gone somewhere. Her gaze was worried because she needed to get information from him, and she could not understand where he could have hidden at this moment. The town madman screamed and stomped his feet for them to open their eyes and finally see the truth. His voice was full of despair, and his words sounded like a call to action, forcing those around him to think for a moment about what was hidden beyond the usual boundaries of reality. It was a church missionary who told them that a being had appeared possessing the body of the deceased and was now walking among them, his words seeming as mystical as his worn-out cassock, and everything around was filled with anxious whispers. The naive crowd was led by his stories, ready to pay for the amulets he offered, and for the continuation of his story, as if they were looking for a simple explanation for their fears and unfulfilled hopes, burdened with ignorance and naivety. Celicia winced, not understanding how anyone could believe such nonsense. Her mind was far from mysticism, and she could not understand why those around her lost touch with reality, exchanging it for fruitless promises. To her disappointment, Cain also fell for it, and listened with rapture to the lies of the local priest. His eyes glued to the words as if they contained truth, and she could not hide her disappointment that he could believe such nonsense. Hands grabbed the sword and pulled it out of its sheath. The tension in the air became palpable as she realized that if the situation did not change, she would be forced to intervene because this was not just an accident, but a clear threat that required immediate action. The salesman greeted the guests at the family gun shop, his voice full of warmth and his gaze attentive, as if he saw in each visitor a potential buyer who appreciated the quality of his goods. The customer turned out to be Celicia herself, who entered through the doorway, her steps confident, and her presence filling the room with a slight excitement, as if the aristocrat herself had come here for a special purpose. The man blushed from the beauty of the noblewoman. His gaze became confused, and his inner excitement did not leave him, because in front of him stood not just a client, but the very embodiment of elegance and grace, which he could not help but notice. Fixing her hair, Celicia stated that she was interested in the sword. Her words were clear and confident. She looked like a true daughter of the aristocracy. She knew what she wanted, and did not allow herself to waste time on unnecessary details. When the salesman suddenly put his finger to her lips and confidently said that he knew what she wanted, his confidence seemed almost unexpected, and her gaze became more wary, as if he anticipated her desires without words. He placed his hand on the fabric and began to grab the limited edition latest collection. His movements were fast and precise, as if he knew what to offer, without wasting a second, because each item was valuable to a true connoisseur of weapons. The lady's daggers were light beautiful and decorated with stones. Their exquisite shape and shine seemed to attract attention, but despite all their attractiveness, Celicia did not hide the fact that her goal was precisely the sword. But the noblewoman interrupted the seller, saying that she needed exactly the sword. Her voice was decisive. She clearly was not going to waste time on something less important, and her persistence only emphasized her confidence. Putting a monocle on his eye, the man happily declared that he would help her find a suitable weapon, his face shining with pleasure, as if he had finally found something that would satisfy the tastes of a true connoisseur. The beauty showed the guy the blade she had in her hands, wondering where it came from. Her gaze was cold and calm, but in its depths, one could read wariness, as if she already had a premonition that this weapon was hiding more than it seemed at first glance. Looking at the blade, the guy couldn't help but admire its skillful work, because it was not just a weapon, but a real masterpiece whose perfection in every line and curve reminded of the skill put into its creation. Looking away and hesitating for a moment, the salesman admitted that his shop was more famous not for its strength, but for the beauty of its weapons, which attracted customers with their elegance and sophistication, which did not always correspond to the brutality of the combat blades. Disappointed and slightly upset, Celicia walked outside, determined to find her butler, not wanting to lose him in the crowd again, as her worry for him became more and more palpable with every step she took. Suddenly, the beautiful noblewoman ran into a stranger on the road, not noticing him in time, and hitting his shoulder, felt her heart beat faster from surprise, and her face turned red from slight embarrassment. She irritably stared at the back of the boar, who it seemed did not even think to apologize for the collision, but only continued to go his own way, completely ignoring his own bad manners and rudeness. The heat made sweat run down the lady's face, and despite the discomfort, she felt a strong desire to quench her thirst, mentally cursing the heat that had not left her alone throughout the day. Suddenly, a man appeared on the road shouting loudly about selling cool drinks, his words enticing tired travelers and passers-by promising rest and relief from the heat, which immediately attracted the attention of Celicia. The aromatic beer with foam stood on the table, the full mug beckoned with its appearance, and the promise of instant relief, since the mug was filled to the brim, and steam rose from it, spreading into the air like summer itself. But as soon as the boy turned away for a minute, the drink disappeared from the surface of the table. Someone stole it, and the girl quickly appeared next to him, clearly not embarrassed in her actions, quickly grabbing the beer and drinking it in one gulp. It was Celicia who, oblivious to those around her, drank the beer in one gulp, as if nothing could stop her, and made no attempt to justify her behavior to those who might judge her. Crossing her lips and covering her face with her hand, Celicia forced out words indignantly, complaining about the unpleasant taste of the drink that left an unpleasant aftertaste that prevented her from enjoying the moment and the feeling of coolness. At this point, the guy, noticing her reaction, loudly announced that Celicia had become a new participant in the local drinking contest, and the crowd, not holding back their emotions, exclaimed loudly, applauding, supporting the girl in her unexpected decision. The competition was simple. Participants had to drink as much beer as possible from large barrels, and the winner received recognition and well-deserved fame, and the hall exploded with excited conversations foreshadowing a fun atmosphere. Quietly, barely audibly, the guy whispered that for a fragile and weak woman like her, it would be very difficult to cope with such a difficult task as drinking more than everyone else, and his words cut into Celicia's soul, making her feel uncomfortable. However, hearing his rude remark, Celicia felt a flare of rage in her chest, which only fueled her determination and stubbornly strengthened her resolve to win, despite the words trying to weaken her confidence. With determination and a slight tension in her hand, she grabbed the mug, brought it to her, and squeezed it tightly, preparing for another sip, knowing that this fight would be her chance to prove to everyone that she was not going to give in to the competition. Succumbing to the excitement, the noblewoman began to take large gulps of beer. Her breathing became faster and faster, and the crowd around her shouted louder and louder, encouraging her, creating an atmosphere in which the desire to win became even stronger. As soon as the last sip was taken, the empty cup landed on the table with a loud sound, sounding like the final chord in this crazy competition, filling the space with a feeling of victory and the fact that she did everything to achieve this goal. Red and drunk Celicia wiped her mouth with her hand, trying to regain some composure after the stormy competition, and her face was burning with joy and pride for winning, although she could barely stay on her feet. Her opponent, breathing heavily, unable to contain his fatigue, looked at the girl, who was fragile in appearance, but as it turned out, could drink much more than anyone would have thought, leaving him at a loss. Celicia was the winner of the competition, and the man delightedly and solemnly grabbed her hand, raised it into the air, showing the crowd who was the best among them all, and the noise of delight was deafening. Happy and contented, the noblewoman smiled, accepting the praise and shouts of the admiring spectators, feeling the gaze of everyone who admired her fortitude and dexterity, which only strengthened her confidence. As a prize, she received a bottle of Green Devil, a special alcohol intended for the most persistent, and now it was her personal trophy which symbolized her victory. Suddenly, everything started to swim before her eyes. People's figures became blurry, and her consciousness quickly floated away into the fog, and Celicia felt herself losing control, unable to stay on her feet. Hands reached out to her, offering to help her back to the castle, but everything seemed unreal and blurry, and she could barely make out who was next to her. Suddenly, Cain appeared behind her, grabbing her by the shoulders, holding her on her feet, and pulling her towards him carefully and confidently, so as not to let the lady fall. His actions were full of determination and protection. The screams of the people around them became unintelligible, but those who tried to help justified themselves by saying that they simply wanted to help the drunk lady and had no evil intentions, trying to justify their actions. The butler's face twisted in anger. He immediately recognized the lie in their words and knew that their intentions were far from good, and his protection of the lady became even more determined, ready to do anything to keep her safe. Suddenly, a woman's hand calmed Cain, and Celicia, looking affectionately at the butler, expressed surprise at where he had been for so long, since her search for him had been accompanied by a feeling of emptiness and discontent from his absence. With a blush on his face, the man felt embarrassed for his mistake and sincerely apologized to the lady, promising that he would not allow such situations to happen again, demonstrating all his devotion and responsibility for her well-being. The peasants standing aside were shocked to see how much influence the mistress had over her servant, for such an interaction seemed unusual and even surprising to them, bringing a new wave of respect for such relationships into their lives. Frowning, Cain began to carefully examine the air around him, his face taking on a wary expression as he realized that something was wrong, and he was inwardly indignant, not understanding how the mistress could allow herself such weakness. Celicia staggered and admitted to drinking, smiling, as she held up a bottle of Green Devil, not seeing any shame in it, but rather feeling a sense of victory and freedom despite the consequences. Meanwhile, children ran through the streets, filling the space with laughter and joy, and ordinary villagers joyfully celebrating created an atmosphere of fun that could not help but infect everyone around, filling the day with an indescribable light. Standing next to Cain, Celicia watched the children running happily down the street, absorbed in joy and fun, feeling how their genuine laughter filled the air with invisible energy and genuine happiness. Cain noticed that the parade that everyone was talking about had already started, and this made him feel the need to hurry, because every moment was important, so as not to miss the most important events of the holiday. Despite being very drunk, Celicia felt unwell, but was determined not to leave the party as the atmosphere of fun was too important for her to interrupt this moment and leave it unfinished. Celicia froze when she heard the guy's words about how she shouldn't have overdone it with alcohol, and that it would be better to relax, although her thoughts on this matter were already full of embarrassment and determination to continue enjoying the party. The woman's hand confidently grabbed the man's, pulling him towards her, which at that moment seemed to Celicia not just a gesture of closeness, but also a sign of devotion and trust, despite the tension she felt. Suddenly, knights appeared on the streets, galloping on their horses and waving red flags, which immediately attracted the attention of everyone around, and the crowd began to worry, discussing what exactly they brought with them to the festival. Celicia stood on tiptoe, trying to get a glimpse of what was happening, but the crowd of people trying to see the party blocked her entire field of vision, and she couldn't catch even the slightest detail. There were so many people that the air was filled with their anticipation and impatience, each of whom was trying to get to the central square to witness this grand event that beckoned them with its grandeur. Celicia, a little annoyed that she couldn't see anything, started nudging Cain, letting him know that she had a good idea that could fix the situation and make the holiday more accessible to her. Pointing to the child sitting on her father's shoulders, Celicia smiled and asked Cain to put her on his shoulders too, so that she could get a better view of what was happening in the square and feel like she was part of this living picture. Happy and contented, Celicia quietly murmured that she could finally see everything with her own eyes, feeling like not only a spectator, but also an important part of this magnificent event full of delight and wonder. The knights, majestic and confident in their strength, rode on their powerful horses, their armor shining in the sun, emphasizing their strength and nobility, like true warriors ready to defend honor and loyalty. Cain, holding Celicia securely on his shoulders, asked her with a slight concern not to move, warning her that she could easily lose her balance and fall, while her gaze slid over the surrounding celebration. Among the knights, one stood out in particular, a blond young man with aristocratic features. His snow-white skin and powerful muscular arms spoke of his strength and origin, attracting the attention of everyone who was nearby. Suddenly, this rider turned his head, and seeing a strange girl in the crowd, who could not stay on her feet and began to fall, he immediately reacted, ready to help and support. His attention was now focused on her. Celicia, covering her mouth with her hand, began to complain to Cain, saying that she felt sick and nauseous because what was happening around her was too intense and not quite suitable for her condition. Having decided to look around and try to understand what was going on around her, Celicia looked up where there were also many people, and the tall buildings created a majestic, slightly oppressive view, emphasizing the scale of the celebration. At this time, in the light of the bright sun, from the shadow of one of the balconies, as if hiding from view, a strange figure in a long cloak appeared, which seemed suspicious and caused a feeling of wariness in the noblewoman. The strange figure, hidden in the shadow of the balcony, held a crossbow pointed downwards, which undoubtedly indicated her professionalism. She was a mercenary ready to do her duty. The man standing in the shadows had unforgettable white hair, dark skin, and a piercing gaze that immediately made you feel his presence, as if he could penetrate your very soul. Celicia instantly recognized him as the same man who had saved her from the murderer in the castle. Shock and confusion overwhelmed her, and she froze, unable to tear her eyes away from his figure. At that moment, a shot rang out, and an arrow with extraordinary accuracy pierced the body of one of the knights, knocking him off his horse, which caused instant chaos among the guards and attracted the attention of everyone around. The other knights, eager to protect the prince, cried out loudly that they should have been more careful and immediately drew their swords, preparing to meet the possible threat, while chaos erupted around them. Celicia, worried about what was happening, suddenly called her butler, but at the same moment he fell, clasping her in his arms, trying to support her, as if he himself had lost his balance under the weight of what was happening. At that moment, the noblewoman, losing her footing, began to fall and waved her arms in panic, desperately, trying to maintain her balance. But fate, it seemed, did not want to leave her a chance. Cain, reacting in time, caught her, protecting her from the pain of the fall, his arms holding her tightly, and he tried to keep her from getting hurt, despite all the confusion that reigned around. When asked by a worried servant, Celicia calmly replied that she felt fine, but her voice was quiet and tense, which betrayed her true state. However, suddenly grabbing Cain by the shoulders, Celicia began to cough, and her facial expression betrayed her discomfort. She was nauseous, which became obvious to everyone around her, who was worried about her. One of the knights, with noticeable concern in his voice, approached the young couple, and apologizing for the disturbance, asked for forgiveness for interrupting their conversation. But his words only added anxiety to the atmosphere. Having discovered a suspicious guard who seemed to be responsible for the disorder, he moved away from the lady and her butler, and the events around became uncontrollable, disturbing the harmony and tranquility of the holiday. Meanwhile, the real killer, hidden in a dark corner of the gateway, was breathing heavily, pressing his hand to his sides, and remained unnoticed by most, hiding in the shadows and avoiding attention. Celicia, noticing him in the distance, was in no hurry to reveal her observation and continued to closely monitor the situation, realizing that hasty actions could lead to dangerous consequences. It is unlikely that anyone would have guessed to look into the dark tunnel and look for suspicious individuals there, because the shadow was a hidden and safe place for such a person about whom no one suspected. With the festival over, Celicia decided to return to the castle where she could rest and gather her thoughts in order to once again immerse herself in the familiar atmosphere of the castle's peace. In the quiet, cozy room, Celicia gently dried her damp scalp with a towel, removing any remaining moisture and feeling the warmth return to her body. After completing this process, she threw the towel over the back of the chair, freeing herself from unnecessary fuss, and allowed herself to enjoy a moment of peace and solitude. The noblewoman, concentrating on pouring a bright green drink into a glass, thoughtfully said that it seemed like an unexpected guest had come to her. Something in the atmosphere had changed, and she felt like someone was hiding in the shadows of the room, waiting for the right moment to appear. In the very shadow of the room, where the dim light barely illuminated the space, someone was hiding, and Celicia, unable to ignore his presence, asked him to leave with a calm but decisive intonation. Her gaze was intent and confident. Soon, the tall and powerful body of a man emerged from the dark corner, and he slowly walked towards the noblewoman, approaching with a confident gait, as if this moment had long been predicted by him, and not a single detail could knock him off course. Celicia, holding herself with dignity, picked up a glass of bright green drink, and without letting the man out of her sight, calmly and with interest, asked what purpose had brought him to her, an old acquaintance who seemed to have appeared without any warning. She took a few measured sips of the drink, feeling the alcohol slowly penetrate her body, and allowed herself to relax for a moment, but at the same time remained alert, ready for any turn of events. The guest who suddenly appeared in the room was Aias, that same mysterious young man with dazzling white hair and bright blue eyes, whose combination of beauty and mystery immediately attracted attention. Standing behind the aristocrat, the man, his figure seemingly dissolving into the shadows, spoke in a quiet but confident voice, asking the question that was clearly tormenting him. When did she finally understand who he really was, and how long had he been watching her? The lady, as if awakening from deep thought, turns towards him, her bare feet touching the soft carpet. And at that moment, everything in her behavior betrays her tension, as if she realized that this moment was inevitable. Somehow, this guy strangely resembled the man who had recently been on the wanted list, although the poster that Celicia had recently looked at had a face with black hair, and this discrepancy made her feel strangely uneasy. Celicia, taking a few steps forward and approaching the guy, quietly said that she always remembers people their familiar faces, and although she could not say exactly when he became so important, his face became an integral part of her memory. After this, Celicia began to walk around the night, moving slowly around him, with the repeated question of why he had come into her presence. Was it really his intention to kill her, like so many others before him? At some point, she realized that it was quite possible that she, this noble lady, could become the key that could prove the innocence of the family of traitors to the Empire, whose name remained in doubt in the eyes of many. The castle was strangely dark and unguarded, allowing many strangers to enter its walls unhindered, unnoticed by most. And this not only poses a threat, but also holds a number of unsolved mysteries. However, Aias, with conviction and seriousness, informed the lady that he had come for a completely different purpose. On the contrary, his intentions were to protect her, offering his help as a faithful guardian. His mailed hand tightened its grip on the silver-ornamented sword hilt, for a moment showing confidence and determination in his actions, as if emphasizing his readiness to fulfill his promise. With a serious and focused expression on his face, Aias asked the noblewoman to accept him as her personal guard, convincing her that he could be trusted and that he would support her in any endeavor. During their conversation, it suddenly became clear that this mysterious young man was wanted, and many people pursuing him dreamed of his death, which added even more mystery to his personality. The life of a handsome man hiding behind the mask of his charm and attractiveness turned out to be difficult. On his way, he met not only enemies, but also mercenaries who were sent to his death, desperately trying to get rid of his presence. Finding himself in a difficult situation, Aias admitted that his main goal was to serve Celicia until she regained her memories, because it was her memories that he desperately needed. Wrapping her arms around herself and frowning, asked with obvious surprise why her memory was so important to this man and what he hoped to find in her past, since she herself remembered nothing about her life. Aias fell silent, looking down as if his own thoughts had confused him, and he didn't know how to explain his intentions exactly. And the silence dragged on painfully, long breaking the silence between them. Finally, after a long pause, the knight answered in a measured tone that his offer would only benefit her, and although his words sounded confident, there was a certain mystery in them that Celicia could sense but not fully understand. Smiling slyly, Celicia asked the question that had been tormenting her for a long time. What if her memories never returned? She couldn't believe that her past would remain hidden forever. Bowing his head low and looking at her with an expression that both concealed and promised, the knight assured her that nothing would be required of her if her memory did not return, for it was his proposal, and he would not undertake any obligations. This guy could have made an excellent guard. He would not only be strong and resilient, but would also have rare fencing skills that would allow him to effectively protect his master and perform any combat missions. The lady agreed with his words, and suddenly, reaching out her hand, opened one of the drawers of the antique cabinet in which, as it turned out, was hidden a blade that belonged to the unsuccessful murderer who left his mark on this story. She carefully handed him the dangerous knife, asking if he had encountered this object somewhere before, perhaps in the hands of someone he knew who was connected with the events that led to such unexpected turns. Aias quickly realized that this dagger had been left here by a mercenary who clearly had his own goals and connections. But why he had left the weapon behind remained a mystery that needed to be solved as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the fire gradually died down, and only a few coals barely smoldering weakly illuminated the dark space, and the last logs quietly crackled as if saying goodbye to this moment. Celicia turned away from the man and, moving smoothly, headed towards the bed, where she was in a long, snow-white nightgown, perfectly emphasizing her grace and elegance, like a graceful shadow in the silence of the night. Her hand gently sliding across the bed, lay on the soft bedspread, quietly tapping on it as if inviting someone to sit down next to her, creating an atmosphere of comfort and tranquility in which there was no room for anxiety. The girl, with a slight but warm smile, invited the guest to sit down next to her and rest, as if wanting to share the moment of peace that enveloped the room and give the opportunity to relax in her calm and friendly company. Aias opened his mouth in shock and stuttered, asking what this decent-looking lady, whose words and actions were in such sharp contrast to his expectations, that he could not immediately believe what was happening actually meant. On the table in front of him stood a glass of drink, which seemed to be only a symbol of the state into which the unexpected situation had plunged him. He slowly looked at it, not knowing what exactly he should do next. The beauty, noticing his bewilderment, raised her hand, instantly realizing that Aias perceived her good intentions as a manifestation of intoxication, and tried to dispel his doubts, showing care and patience that he clearly did not expect from her. The noblewoman began to carefully take out bandages from the box on the table, as if she knew in advance that her help would be needed, and that not everything in this situation would be as simple as she would like. The knight had a painful wound in his side from the recent parade, and the blood was still slowly leaking out, adding to the situation an additional sense of anxiety and despair that both of them could feel. Staring thoughtfully at the bandage, the lady said with a slight hint of concern that it was unlikely that Aias would be able to run normally in such a state and fulfill his obligations, since his wound required immediate attention and care. Irritated by the noblewoman's persistence, which left no room for doubt or indecision, Aias finally took a decisive step towards her, deciding that he needed to act and not waste time on talking. After which, the guy leaning towards the lady said sternly, with a clear threat in his voice, that in the current situation, she should have been much more careful, and not him, since he, despite the wound, remained in a more advantageous position. However, Celicia did not fall for the threats, and with a confident and fearless smile, replied that his words meant nothing to her, which amazed her interlocutor, making him understand that she could not be frightened by ordinary threats. She carefully placed her palm on the man's wounded body, as if trying to convey to him, with her touch, the support and attention that he so badly needed at that moment. Aias winced in pain at her touch. A sharp pain ran through his body, and he couldn't hold back a groan, although he tried to maintain the appearance of fortitude. Suddenly, from a strong push, the couple began to fall, and the beauty's hair scattered in the air began to flutter, as if under the influence of an invisible force, giving everything that was happening an almost magical atmosphere. Aias, using his strength and size, pinned the lady to the floor, his heavy body seeming like an impenetrable barrier, leaving her with almost no room to maneuver. With difficulty overcoming the resistance, Celicia crawled out from under the knight, turning him over onto his back, after which she sat on his chest, regaining her balance, and holding back her pulse, which was steadily accelerating. Looking down at him, she thoughtfully wondered what could have prompted the killer to be interested in her memories. What hidden motives were hidden behind his actions, which seemed so extraordinary? The doors leading to the balcony were open, and the cool night air filled the room, giving a feeling of freedom and freshness, while the stars in the dark sky twinkled as if watching what was happening. The magnificent castle, lit only by the dim light of the moon, looked especially beautiful and mysterious at night, its grandeur and secrets hidden in the shadows, and the air was filled with mysterious whispers. The bandages carefully wrapped around the man's body covered his chest and shoulder to stop the bleeding and ease the pain, but their whiteness contrasted with his wounded state, highlighting the vulnerability of this strong man. Edgar watched as the experienced healers bandaged his comrade anxiously, monitoring every movement, hoping that the knight's condition would improve and the wounds would not be too serious. The doctor smiled encouragingly and assured the heir to the throne that the knight had no serious injuries and that he would soon be ready to undergo a course of rehabilitation, returning to normal life and service. The young man lying unconscious on the bed looked exhausted. His lips were dry, and his face was pale, as if his strength had gone away in an instant, leaving not a drop of energy. All around on the shelves of the large office, there were books filled with knowledge and stories, and the office itself, in which important conversations were taking place, was filled with an atmosphere of anxiety and tension because someone had dared to commit an assassination. One of the guards, bowing his head in respect, explained that despite all their efforts, they still had not been able to find the villain who had organized the attack, which made the situation even more difficult. The prince, turning to face the window, quietly said that apparently someone was not pleased with his return to the empire, hinting at the political intrigue that could be hidden behind this attack. The guard looked away and added that it was extremely strange to commit a crime during the day in front of everyone so openly and brazenly, because it only caused additional suspicions and risk. The prince's gaze, cold and full of fury, burned with the fire of hatred, as if he had already anticipated the consequences of this act and was ready to take revenge for the attempt on his life. The guard, immediately realizing that he had gone too far with his careless words, bowed his head, fell to his knees, and began to loudly and sincerely ask for forgiveness from the heir to the throne. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Edgar listened silently to his apology, without interrupting, but deep down, he knew that it would not solve the problem, especially since there were still no rumors about the nobility possibly involved in the assassination attempt. The window overlooked the city, where the majestic houses of aristocrats stood symbolizing power and wealth. But despite the beautiful picture, only anxiety and a premonition of betrayal raged in the prince's head. The guard, quietly and cautiously, suggested that the assassination attempt could have been the result of actions by one of the prestigious groups that were active in the city, hiding their real goals under a mask of nobility and legality. With an evil grin, Edgar stated that the assassination attempt was the perfect chance to finally destroy all the traitors, leaving no doubt that they would be punished for their insolence. The guard, however, for some reason did not leave, but suddenly announced that he had another important news for the ruler, causing the prince to become wary and expect something that could change the course of events. While the man was hurriedly tapping his fingers on the table, the knight apparently hesitated, unable to immediately utter what he had said, but finally blurted out that Lady Celicia had returned, adding an unexpected twist to the situation. The heir to the throne's hand froze in mid-air in shock as he realized the meaning of those words. Celicia's return could not be accidental, and it could mean, at the very least, a revival of old intrigues. Suddenly, the box of ink fell to the floor so hard did the prince throw it from the emotions that overwhelmed him, and its contents spilled, leaving a stain on the marble floor, symbolizing the chaos that would soon overtake them. The guard, faced with this outburst of anger, felt the blood flow from his head, from the blow, realizing that he expected such a reaction from the master, because he knew how important information about Celicia was to the prince. The nobleman's eyes were blazing with rage as he ordered his former fiancée to be brought here immediately, his voice full of determination and anger, as if this was the final step to restoring justice. The prince turned away, giving the order to the guards to leave, because he himself wanted to rest a little after a long and stressful day that left only fatigue and darkness of thoughts in his soul. Left alone, the ruler took a ring with a red gemstone from his pocket, sighing heavily when his gaze fell on the decoration that reminded him of the past and his former fiancée. He clutched the ring tightly in his fist, as if trying to lock his feelings inside, thinking about the one who had once been a part of his life, but now remained only a painful memory. There were many different gifts lying on the floor: toys, shoes, boxes of jewelry. All these items, as if left over from old holidays, now seemed like just a reminder of lost feelings. Cain, noticing that the lady was looking at these things quietly, stated that they were all gifts from nobles who had once tried to win her favor, which added irony to the situation. Suddenly, Celicia found a strange purple potion, and intrigued wondered what it could be, because its appearance and smell attracted her attention as if it was hiding something unusual within itself. Cain, sitting down next to him and carefully examining the bottle, declared that it was perfume, noting that it had an incredibly pleasant aroma, which seemed to have been specially selected to charm those around him. Celicia, unimpressed by the item, called it useless junk, believing that the potion had no value and would not bring any benefit to her life. There was a story about a sword that was forged by a dwarf for a knight about 500 years ago, especially for fighting a dragon, and this sword became a real legend, personifying courage and strength. Another possible gift that Celicia could appreciate would be an arrow lost by an elf with unique properties, but its fate was full of secrets and mysteries like its history itself. Cain awkwardly stated that things like these perfumes and rare gifts were incredibly valuable and expensive, even for the imperial family, emphasizing their rarity and exclusivity in this world. A fresh bouquet of flowers lay beside the lady, and their scent pleasantly filled the air, creating an atmosphere of comfort and calm that contrasted with the tension in the conversation. Looking down sadly, Cain suddenly admitted that in the past, Celicia preferred flowers and pleasant scents to jewelry, and that was what she valued most, creating an atmosphere of beauty and tenderness around her. After which, with a slight sadness in his voice and a soft smile on his face, he added that it would be normal if the lady's preferences changed, because times change, and with them, tastes change. As the butler went away to put the flowers in a vase, the lady suddenly called him from behind, and calmly declaring her intention to hire security, added that she could no longer afford to be vulnerable in this dangerous world. The roses were carefully placed in a vase. Their petals, as if responding to the light, blossomed, filling the room with a delicate aroma. At that moment, the whole atmosphere seemed full of harmony, refinement, and peace. However, suddenly, a bottle with some kind of potion standing nearby unexpectedly fell and broke, and the fragments scattered across the floor, accompanying this moment with unexpected news, which seemed to break the silence, and the flowers, having lost their support, scattered around, creating a mess. Cain suddenly began to tremble. His body seemed to freeze, and his gaze became empty and anxious, which was extremely unusual for him, because he was always distinguished by his resilience and confidence in any situation. Celicia, noticing the man's strange reaction, immediately approached, and looking at him with concern, asked what was wrong with him, trying to understand what caused his strange behavior. It turned out that Cain had started coughing up blood, leaving marks on his palms. His condition had deteriorated sharply, and now he was in a state that Celicia did not expect to see from such a strong and confident person. Aias was lying in a luxurious bed, his body only partially covered by a soft blanket, creating an atmosphere of comfort and peace, while his relaxed breath barely touched the air. The entire bedroom was decorated with expensive interior items. The balcony, which opened directly from the room, was lit by a dim light, coming through the glass, creating a soft atmosphere. It was snowing outside, and the cold winter air penetrated into the room, filling it with freshness and coolness. Suddenly, the man woke up abruptly, as if from a nightmare, quickly jumping up from his seat, as if he was tormented by terrible anxiety. He rose in fright, unable to remain sitting. He leaned his hand on the bed, feeling the damp sweat sliding across his skin, reminding him that he had just experienced something terrible and unexpected that had caused his body to react in this way. There, not far from him, stood his sword, shining ready for action, as if waiting for its owner to once again become a reliable companion in unknown adventures and battles. The guy was surrounded by a truly luxurious environment. Curtains, tables, and chairs. Everything was made of expensive materials, creating an atmosphere of wealth and comfort, which contrasted with his anxious state. At that moment, Aias noticed that his stomach was bandaged, and there were no traces left at the site of the previous wound, as if someone had carefully taken care of his wound, providing assistance and preventing serious consequences. The knight stood up, realizing that what was happening around him was not just a coincidence. He walked forward across the room, slowly untying the bandages that still held onto his body, hiding the mystery of what was happening. Aias stood in shock, his gaze fixed on his body, where there was not a single wound and not even a scar from the pain he had previously felt. Everything seemed incredibly strange and impossible. After getting dressed, the man, still in shock from what had happened, walked down the hallway thinking about how Celicia had no magical abilities before and how she was able to heal him when he was in critical condition. Suddenly, Aias noticed a strange noise coming from one of the doors nearby, and without thinking, hurried to the source of the sound, his heart beating faster, with a premonition that something important might happen. In the room he opened, Cain was lying in the arms of a lady, blood was flowing from his mouth, and he looked extremely weak. It seemed like he was much worse, and the situation was much more serious than anyone would have expected. Celicia sat next to him, frowning, trying to figure out what had happened to his butler, wondering if his condition was due to poisoning, but she couldn't be sure since there were no obvious signs. The girl extended her hand to use healing magic and try to ease Cain's suffering, but suddenly pulled her palm back sharply, hearing the voice of their guest, which suddenly sounded from the other side, breaking the silence and concentration. Sitting on the floor next to the butler, Celicia explained with concern that Cain had suddenly fallen and felt ill, although the reason for this, according to her, was difficult to understand, since there was nothing foreshadowing trouble. On the floor next to her stood an open box of perfume, and the lid was slightly open, and inside were visible bottles of fragrant liquid, but something was strange about it, as if something was wrong. Covering his nose, Aias, carefully picking up one of the bottles, stated that this perfume was most likely poisoned, as its smell was unusually sharp and suspicious, as if there was something hidden behind it. These spirits, incredibly rare and dangerous, caused awe in even the most experienced connoisseurs of magic and alchemy, since their power and influence went beyond ordinary understanding. The herbs from which these perfumes were made were so rare and difficult to obtain that they were almost impossible to find. Moreover, they were deadly poisonous, and even the slightest mistake in their processing could lead to death. The fact that Cain, despite his terrible ordeal, was still alive, although unconscious, was a real miracle, because such conditions as his usually ended tragically, but in his case, death was avoided. Aias silently raised his head sharply, feeling a strange tension when he realized that in the box, among other things, there was someone's signature, but without the sender's address, which added mystery and intrigue to everything that was happening. Celicia felt the knight's words reverberate through her soul, dealing a moral blow. His admission that everything had happened because of an accident that she herself had caused made her feel deep guilt and regret. However, Aias was right. The lady froze in thought, realizing that she could only heal the butler if he was still breathing and not dead, and this realization brought her even more pain. Suddenly, without saying a word, the beauty rose to her feet. Next to her, at the same moment, Aias froze his gaze, not leaving her, as if waiting for some sign or decision. The man, without hiding his confidence, confirmed that his offer to become her guard still stood. His words sounded firm and clear, leaving no room for doubts or excuses. The woman's hand confidently rested on the knight's chest, and at that moment, he was accepted to a new job in the castle, which seemed to be the final step in their unusual interaction. The guy, stunned by what was happening, stared at the outstretched hand, and suddenly realized that with such a gesture, the lady seemed to want to make a deal with him that could change his fate in this place. At her companion's questioning look, Celicia, who seemed stern and cold, explained that she did not trust him or anyone else, so she sought to make a magical deal with him to guarantee her interests and ensure her safety. However, the guy resolutely refused, insisting that he was ready to sign the contract, but not to touch the lady, considering this gesture too intimate and complicated for their first step in working together. With a sly grin playing on his nerves, the noblewoman stated that there was much more power hidden in words and promises than in any signed contracts, and that her words could hold a stronger bond than any official document. The man, with obvious reluctance, but nevertheless resolutely raised his hand, feeling the tension in the vein on it rise with each movement, as if his body anticipated the importance and consequences of this gesture, which could not be undone. This was followed by a formal handshake between the nobles, a gesture that sealed a deal, filling the atmosphere with a sense of responsibility and seriousness as a symbol of mutual agreement and a bond that could now not be broken. Then the lady added that the traitor to the deal, the one who broke his obligations, would pay with his life, and her words sounded cold and confident, as if there was a hidden threat in them, reminding them of the inevitable consequences for those who dared to betray their agreement. After the pact was made, Aias felt a heaviness, as if an invisible force was penetrating his body, and the magic that held them together became tangible, penetrating his consciousness and into his very depths, connecting them with an invisible but powerful thread. Suddenly, unable to contain his curiosity, Aias asked his interlocutor if she was going to bury the butler, to which the girl, with surprise on her face, asked him again, not understanding what exactly he meant with this strange and unexpected question. When the beauty finally realized the seriousness of the situation, her face distorted into an expression of longing, awkwardness, and dislike, as if she realized something that put her in an awkward position and caused an internal struggle. Placing her hand on her chest, Celicia calmly but confidently said that she had a healing potion that would keep Cain from dying, and her words sounded like a promise, calming the anxiety and giving hope for salvation. The butler stood in a clearing, surrounded by many bright flowers. The wind gently swayed the grass, and he patiently waited for his mistress, feeling the peace and harmony of this moment when nature and his soul were in the same rhythms. Meanwhile, a beauty with long hair sat among the plants. Enthusiastically telling something, her voice sounded soft and enchanting, creating an atmosphere of peace as if nature itself was listening to her words. The two of them spent time in nature, laughing and enjoying the simple joys that the moment brings. Serenity and a sense of oneness with the world in which there was no room for worries and problems. Cain was happy that his mistress was alive and well, and a sincere smile blossomed on his face when he realized that during all this time, their bonds had not weakened, but on the contrary, had become stronger and stronger. Suddenly, the noblewoman approached him, her movements soft and confident, and by gently placing the flower behind his ear, she seemed to add another touch to their closeness, making the moment filled with magic and warmth. Celicia looked at her butler with a loving and tender look. Her smile was full of tenderness and affection, and when she quietly said his name, there was a special warmth in her voice that penetrated straight into the soul. The young couple began to dance their bodies, moving smoothly to the rhythm swirling around the bright colors that enveloped them, creating an atmosphere of lightness and harmony, as if the whole world had stopped for this moment. However, as soon as Cain blinked, he found himself not in the clearing, but in a room where his mistress was already standing before him in a green dress. He realized that it was just a dream, and waking up, he realized that he had returned to reality again. The butler sat up in bed, his heart heavy, and sadly apologized to Celicia, feeling that he had become a burden to her, despite all the efforts he had made. He touched his head with his hand, sobbing from the recent dream that left warm memories in his soul, as if it was so real that he did not want to let it go. Celicia, noticing his condition, said affirmatively that he looked very happy in his sleep, as if he was completely absorbed in what he was experiencing at that moment. Smiling awkwardly, the man tried to explain that these were just old memories, nothing more, and his words carried bitterness, as if he was trying to hide his true feelings. The weather outside was beautiful. The sun's rays softly penetrated through the window, filling the room with warmth, while the young couple continued to talk, enjoying every minute of communication and solitude. Suddenly, Celicia revealed that someone mean and cruel had sent them perfume as a gift to poison them, and her words sounded like an alarm bell, interrupting the carefree atmosphere, filling it with a dark threat. Looking away, the beauty added that from now on, she would have more and more ill-wishers who wanted her dead, and these people would become more and more numerous, like a shadow that would haunt her, giving her no peace. The man's hand gripped the fabric of the sheet tightly, his fingers digging into it as if trying to contain his inner turmoil, not wanting to show how much her words had shaken him. Cain, trying to calm both himself and his lady, said loudly that he was all right, but in reality, his heart was full of excitement and anxiety, especially for his mistress, whom he could not leave without protection. The aristocrat agreed that they would have to take serious measures to ensure that such attempts were not repeated. The determination in her voice was clear, and her gaze expressed her readiness to protect her life and those dear to her. Suddenly, clear footsteps were heard from the side, the sounds of men's boots echoing around the room, attracting attention and creating tension in the air, as if something unexpected was about to happen. The butler turned sharply, as he heard footsteps approaching, and his gaze was full of interest. He realized that he and his mistress were not alone, and that something important was about to happen. However, quite quickly, his expression changed to wary surprise, incomprehension, and hidden anger when he realized that his expectations might not have been what he had assumed. Aias entered the room, standing without saying a word, leaning against the wall, as if to assert that he was now their new guard, and his presence was an inevitable part of their lives. Loud, angry cries echoed throughout the castle, filling the atmosphere with tension and anxiety. The day was still young, but within the castle walls there was already a threat hovering like an inevitable storm ready to break at any moment. Cain stubbornly followed his mistress, frustratedly, trying to explain that Aias was not suitable for the role of guardian, since his presence only increased his doubts about the safety of her choice. The guy stood behind the noblewoman and said that she would be punished if anyone found out who she hired as a guard, and hid, threatening her and demonstrating his dissatisfaction with her decision. Suddenly, the beauty froze her green dress, and shoes on the floor created the feeling that everything around her had frozen, as if this moment had become decisive in the fate of the entire situation. Celicia responded sternly that Aias was exactly the one they needed, and her decisive answer left no room for doubt or discussion, emphasizing her firmness in her decision. To which Cain threw up his hands and suggested that it was this suspicious scoundrel who wanted his mistress dead, expressing his dissatisfaction and confidence in his own rightness. Frowning furiously, the man asked why the lady had decided to take this guy as a guard, not hiding his displeasure and confusion at her choice. The lady stated emotionlessly that she did not trust the knight, but their goals coincided and their thoughts were similar, which, despite the lack of trust, made her agree with his presence in this situation. Cain screamed loudly, not understanding how she could be so calm about working with a murderer and a scoundrel. His words were full of anger and bewilderment because he could not understand how she could risk her safety. The man froze at the lady's words about how she couldn't save him every time, and that they should be more careful, as if these words stirred up deep emotions in him and an understanding of how dangerous their situation was. Tilting her head thoughtfully, the beauty decided that they should find out who was behind all these attacks, because understanding the true threat was the first step to protecting against possible danger in the future. She hugged her butler affectionately and expressed the hope that he would be able to understand her intentions, because despite her determination, she hoped that he would support her in this important, risky step. After which, Celicia walked away, leaving the guy standing alone in the hallway, her footsteps sounding in the silence, and he was left with the feeling that an invisible gap had formed between them that could not be overcome. Cain remembered how earlier in the garden he had silently watched his mistress leave for another, feeling the gaze on him that he could not prevent, and this scene that continued to torment him in his memory, like a trace left on his soul. Then the noblewoman and the prince went for a walk. Talking, their conversation was easy, and every step in the fresh air created an atmosphere of ease. But Cain, standing to the side, felt a growing sense of loneliness. Cain clutched a flower in his hand, upset because his lady had abandoned him, leaving only bitterness in his soul, and the flower, as a symbol of irretrievable losses, felt heavy in his palm. The hand loudly placed the glass on the balcony. The sound of glass, which seemed so sharp in the silence, burst into space, tearing apart the moment of her loneliness and unnecessary memories. It was Celicia who decided to get some fresh air in the evening, and went out onto the balcony, enjoying the solitude and wanting to escape from the gloomy thoughts, thinking about what happened during the day. She was determined to somehow convince the butler that they needed Aias as a guard, no less, feeling an inner confidence in her decision, despite the doubts from others. Suddenly, a man with snow-colored hair and a cold gaze appeared out of nowhere in a cloak. His presence was so unexpected that it instantly attracted attention, and his gaze was piercing and hard. The aristocrat's gaze met her new guard, and she froze the unexpected appearance of this man, bringing a strange tension to her heart, as if her plans might be disrupted. The lady stood on the balcony, and the man below on the ground. An invisible distance arose between them, an alienation that pressed on her with its silence and the significance of every step. Celicia awkwardly waved her hand, greeting the knight. In her other hand, she had a glass with a drink. Her gesture was friendly, but it hid inside doubt and bewilderment about what happened. Aias didn't answer her in any way, but silently turned around and walked away. His coldness and detachment felt like an impenetrable wall, leaving no room for words or explanations. The beauty tiredly took another sip of the drink. Her gaze dropped, and her thoughts again carried her away to that reality where she tried to understand what to do now, what she was faced with, and where to move next. After which she pulled the hood over her head, deciding that it was time for her to leave this place and continue on her way, because she felt that the moment had come when she needed to leave everything behind and move forward. The noblewoman turned and walked away, leaving her master on the balcony, her steps sounding determined, but her heart was full of unspoken words and hidden feelings that she could not immediately express. She said to herself that finding out who was behind the assassination attempt was just one of her problems, because there were many other difficult issues along the way that required immediate attention and solutions. The darkness of the corridor swallowed her figure, and there were flowers on the table, symbolizing the liveliness that contrasted with the silence that hung around, creating a feeling of emptiness that could not be avoided. Aias stood next to the other man who held the blade and urged him to find out as soon as possible who this weapon belonged to, because every moment was important in their search and investigation. The red-haired boy noted that this was not the first time the knight had come to him, and that he would do his job quickly and well, the confidence in his words giving the whole process of fierce determination. The man suggested that Aias might have fallen in love with someone, which was why he was acting so strangely. His words were filled with hints that couldn't help but make Aias feel awkward and irritated. The guy coldly replied that his friend was asking too many questions, avoiding further discussions, because he didn't want to reveal his feelings or attract unnecessary attention to himself, to which the man laughed loudly, calling the guard too serious, and hardly anyone would believe in his calmness, because his behavior clearly hid something more that remained beyond the understanding of those around him. Suddenly, the friend stopped laughing and asked the guard if he had heard the latest news, as the situation was starting to unfold in a way they hadn't expected, and every moment was full of new twists and turns. Aias froze when he heard the words that the crown prince was still alive, and that the mercenary who had attempted the attack was still being sought, causing him to instantly realize the importance of what was happening. The boy began to wave his fists in rage, expressing his readiness to catch that daredevil, the murderer, and bring him to their guild, where punishment for his insolence and crime against the upper classes of society would await him. The man then asked the knight if he knew anything about the brave scoundrel who had attempted to kill the crown prince for his act, had become the subject of discussion, and everyone wanted to know more about his personality and motives. Aias answered briefly and coldly that he was not interested in this, and that he knew nothing about the actions of that man, leaving his answer without further clarification, as if to show that he was only interested in his own tasks and goals. The guy grabbed the door handle, and sensing that something was wrong, noticed that someone had been secretly eavesdropping on them the whole time, which immediately caught his attention and made him be on guard. As Aias left the room, another cloaked figure entered, a girl whose face was hidden, leaving only a sense of mystery surrounding her, and a harbinger of something important and unusual. Entering the room, the beauty froze in place, as if sensing the presence of something invisible. The door closed behind her, absorbing all the space and leaving only the whisper of her steps. The red-haired man standing next to him froze as he heard the noblewoman say that she had come to him with one request, causing him to instantly focus on her intentions and the possible consequences. The guild member, seeing her, laughed, reaching for his dagger, and declared that today promised to be an especially interesting day, filled with unexpected twists and new faces. The noble lady who dared to come to the dangerous group turned out to be Celicia, who, despite all the risks, came for the purpose of negotiations, ready to play on the edge between fear and determination. An hour earlier, the noblewoman had been quietly following her new guard, following him through the night, wanting to find out where he was going, despite her wariness and desire to stay in the shadows. Aias, wearing a cloak, entered the building, passing silently past the guards, while the light from the lantern at the entrance followed him, creating soft reflections on his figure and illuminating the darkness that hid his movements. Celicia, looking around carefully, thought about how she should be even more careful in order to move silently after the night, without attracting unnecessary attention and without revealing her intentions. Suddenly, the noblewoman's path was unexpectedly interrupted by a sword that coldly pointed at her stomach, causing her heart to beat faster from fear and surprise. The mercenary roughly ordered the lady to introduce herself before she decided to enter inside, his voice sounding threatening, causing her to freeze in place, as if every step forward could lead to inevitable consequences. With her eyes wide open, the aristocrat babbled that someone had once revealed to her the secret of an existing place where secrets and dangers could be hidden, and her voice, trembling with excitement, seemed unable to hide her confusion. The beauty, holding her breath, told the mercenary about the man with white hair, whose actions left an indelible mark on her memory, after which the mercenary fell silent, thoughtfully, wondering what this could mean for her fate. After a while, the boy, feeling that the woman really had come on business, finally allowed her to enter the guild, holding back a look that could give away his displeasure, and both of them, as if invisible, walked into the shadow of the room. Before fully entering, Celicia paused for a moment, her ears catching the quiet words of the guard, who muttered something about Aias being a real bastard, unsociable and tough, which made her think for a second. The guildmaster, meeting the woman with such unusual interest, spoke loudly, asking if she had come to this harsh, dangerous world only to find out where she could acquire rare and dangerous magical mana stones. Looking at the unicorn statuette that stood on the table, the noblewoman explained, with a slight smile, that her goal was to find worthy allies to exchange rare magical artifacts, knowing how important such deals were in their world. The man with red hair and a scar on his face, sitting at his desk, froze, surprised and intrigued by her words. His gaze became more wary, as if he realized that this woman could be connected to something much more important than a simple deal. After which he suddenly raised his head up. His gaze became contemptuously confident, and then, unable to restrain himself, he laughed loudly, as if the whole situation was a game for him, and he already knew how everything would develop further. After he gave in to his laughter, the man explained with a grin the reason for his mirth. Everyone in this world had long known that the stone business was monopolized by the imperial family, and even the slightest attempt to compete with them was doomed to failure. Outside the windows, night already reigned, engulfing everything around with its dark, silent power, and only the weak light from inside the room fought with its power, as if the shadow of the world itself was peering into this room, hidden from everyone. The lady, staring at the monument, muttered under her breath that she was interested in something completely different, whether some high-born person had recently paid an incredibly high price for one of the rarest and most dangerous magical stones. Mana stones, which had become scarce in this world, were truly rare, and even the reserves kept in the imperial family's vaults were running low, which became a real threat to everyone who depended on their magical power. The man froze as he heard the lady say with a serious expression that someone had recently stolen a magic stone from a nearby mountain, and that it was not just a crime, but a serious challenge that required immediate intervention. With determination and confidence, as befits an aristocrat, she declared that if this stone was used by someone living, then he would certainly pay a high price for his insolence and risk, which violated the ancient laws of this world. The guildmaster, without having time to say anything, suddenly covered his mouth with his hand, and slightly raising his eyebrow, said that it was a very interesting story, told by the lady, adding that, for such a state of affairs, one would need to have very serious evidence. However, according to ancient legends, the mountain where the stone was kept was guarded by a terrible and ferocious dragon, and if someone decided to steal such a powerful artifact, he would have to pay the highest price. Smiling and showing his snow-white teeth, the man fixed his gaze on his interlocutor and asked mockingly how she knew that someone had actually stolen the stone and had not been punished by the dragon's wrath for such a daring theft. The beauty, noticing his persistence, turned away and said that the master was probably too interested in the details of his clients' lives, much more than was really necessary to complete the task, leaving a hint of something more. The guy thought for a moment, assessing the situation, and after thinking, he finally agreed to take on the aristocrat's task, deciding that it would not be as difficult to complete as it seemed at first glance, and that he would still cope. Celicia was likely to return in a month for another conversation, perhaps even to discuss next steps still remaining in a game where every move could be decisive. The morning had come, the sky was clear and cloudless, and the sun rising higher and higher illuminated the majestic castle, with its rays making it even more majestic and insurmountable, as well as its inhabitants. On the table, laid out in one of the luxurious halls of the castle, there was a variety of dishes, from juicy pieces of meat to fresh salads, creating an atmosphere of wealth and sophistication, with notes of splendor and refinement. Celicia, sitting at the table, nodded thoughtfully, almost falling asleep, as if fatigue had overcome her, and her thoughts smoothly carried her into a world of calm reflection where there was no place for worries. Suddenly, she started when she heard a quiet voice next to her ear. It was Cain who, having approached cautiously, stood nearby like a shadow, and his presence immediately brought her out of her reverie. The butler had a decanter of water in his hands, and he looked at his mistress with slight concern and asked if she had slept badly, inquiring about her condition, as always, showing attention to her needs. Celicia clutched her head and quietly lied, saying that she simply couldn't sleep, trying to hide the true reasons for her anxiety, because sometimes it was easier not to talk about what was tormenting her soul. Caring as always, Cain promised to draw her a bath that evening, hoping it would help her relax and perhaps bring back the peaceful sleep she so craved. There was much more food than usual on this day, a variety of dishes from aromatic soups to juicy pieces of meat and fresh vegetables radiating exquisite aromas, creating an atmosphere of celebration and feasting. Suddenly feeling the need to socialize, Celicia invited the butler to eat with her, deciding that at least once they could spend time together, enjoying a meal and not just work and responsibilities. She used cutlery to carefully cut the meat as if every piece was important, and every movement was part of a quiet ritual in which there was no room for haste or anxiety. The young couple ate their meal in awkward silence, only the clatter of forks on plates breaking the atmosphere, as if the entire room was filled with unspoken words and thoughts that remained unexpressed. The girl tried to start a conversation by admiring the food, but Cain, quietly answering with restraint, only noted that the food was the same as yesterday, his voice sounding a little confused, as if words were superfluous. Celicia assumed that they had breakfast together today, and that was why the food tasted better. Her words were full of warmth. She was trying to bring light into the atmosphere filled with awkwardness. Cain interrupted her, saying that he knew everything, and sadly, lowering his head, he realized that the lady had feelings for their new guard. His gaze was lost in thought, and these words were torn out with difficulty. The butler's own opinion was of no importance, and although he was ready to accept any choice his lady made, there remained a heaviness in his heart from the fact that he knew how far that choice might go. Celicia cut the man off coldly, asking why he thought that, her voice laced with icy caution, as if she was trying to convince herself and him of the rightness of her decision without giving in to emotion. Cain raised his head in surprise and turned towards the lady, looking at her with an expression of bewilderment, as if he could not fully comprehend that she was really so confident in her words and actions. Taking the butler's hand tenderly, the lady explained that she had made her decision not out of feelings, but because it was rational. Her words were full of determination. She was seeking confidence in her choice, and there was a cold determination in her eyes. And then she added that Cain was the very person she was very worried and anxious about. Her words sounded soft, but there was gratitude in them and a little warmth that she was hiding. After this, the beauty began to move away, trying to remove her hand from the man's hands. Her movements were cautious, as if she was afraid that her feelings would become too obvious and her inner world would open up to him. But Cain did not let her go, grabbing her hand with his fingers. His gesture was decisive and strong, and in this simple movement was hidden all his care, fear, and desire to keep her, despite everything that was happening between them. With a sly smile, Cain stated that she should have been more careful, or he might have misunderstood her, his words sounding with a slight hint of understatement, as if he was ready to read between the lines, but kept his thoughts to himself. Rising from his seat, the butler offered his help to lead the noblewoman to her room, his voice sounding calm and confident. He was ready to take care of her safety, as always, not paying attention to those hidden feelings that tormented him. Celicia also stood up from her chair, saying that she needed to rest a little. Her tone was a little tired, but there was still a certain grace in it that she tried to maintain even in such moments. Suddenly, Cain handed her a letter. It was an invitation to a celebration in honor of the Crown Prince's return. His gesture was casual, but there was still a mystery in his eyes, as if this letter could lead to something important. Intrigued unfolding the letter, the lady asked who the host of the event was. Her voice soft but with genuine interest, as if she was trying to understand what the invitation was hiding. It was the rich Count of Evelon, a greedy man with a business in magic stones, and a shadow of displeasure flickered in her eyes, because she knew it was not safe to mess with him, but she was still interested in what was behind his proposal. To her question whether they had previously known the nobleman, the girl did not receive a clear answer. Her gaze lingered on the letter, as if expecting Cain to reveal some important detail, but the butler remained silent. After that, Cain stood next to her and reminded her that the maiden didn't have to come to the ball, since she had only recently regained her memory. His words were warm, but with a slight hint of concern, as if he was worried about her condition. Celicia bowed her head and stubbornly said that she should have come to the party, otherwise it would have been rude. Her voice was firm, despite her tiredness. She didn't want anyone to think that her disdain could offend anyone. Tilting his head to the side, the butler asked if this was truly his mistress's wish. His voice calm, but with a slight hint of doubt in it, as if he was seeking confirmation from her words. The letter radiated magic and a strange purple yet familiar scent. The air around it seemed to freeze, and Celicia felt her heart beat faster, recognizing the scent that she associated with danger. The message smelled of that same poisonous perfume and had the same signature, and with each word, her mind began to return to the past, where that smell accompanied her darkest memories. The noblewoman smiled slyly, finally finding a clue as to who her mysterious killer could be. Her mind instantly began to analyze the information received, as if a puzzle began to come together, opening up new horizons for her. Tired. The beauty yawned because she hadn't slept all night. Her eyes were heavy and her thoughts were still confused, but she restrained herself, realizing that she needed to concentrate in order to uncover the secret that had haunted her for so long. Rubbing her eyes with her hand, Celicia admired the weather and muttered that it would be nice to take a nap under the warm sun, her gaze sliding over the bright sky. And she lost herself for a moment in dreams of peace and rest. Suddenly, her gaze caught the gleam of a blade nearby. The bright gleam clearly standing out against the greenery of the courtyard, and slightly squinting her eyes, Celicia realized that in front of her stood a man who knew no fatigue. It was Aias, practicing his swordplay in the courtyard, swinging his sword with such skill that his movements were fluid and fast, as if he were one with the weapon, and his concentration caught her attention. The noblewoman stood there in shock, admiring how someone could go to training so early in the morning without being lazy. Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt her curiosity growing with each passing moment. Aias was breathing heavily, covered in sweat, turning around abruptly when he noticed someone's presence on the street. His eyes immediately found her gaze, and although he didn't say a word, his expression showed that he didn't expect to see anyone at this time. The knight turned his whole body towards his new mistress, greeting her with dignity. His gaze full of respect, and his gestures, despite all his strength, radiated softness and attention to her presence. Tilting his head to the side, the guard asked what the beauty was looking at so intently. Since she couldn't take her eyes off him, his voice was quiet but full of curiosity, as if trying to understand the hidden thoughts of her eyes. The lady awkwardly began to justify herself, saying that she was just passing by, nothing more. Her words sounded soft, but it was clear that she was trying to hide what had really attracted his attention. The tired knight sat down next to the noblewoman, who was standing there. He was taking a break, and despite his fatigue, he couldn't help but notice her gaze, with which she was following his every movement. But deciding not to ask unnecessary questions, he silently sat down next to her. The beauty sat down next to him and announced that she would soon come to the Count's party on her own. Her words were decisive, and despite their calm tone, they contained a certain pride and self-confidence. Without thinking twice, Aias intervened, insisting that he would go with the lady to protect her. His voice as firm and confident as always, and his eyes showing his determination to not let her be in danger. Aias expressed his hope that Celicia was not so naive as to not think that the mercenary would miss an important event. The words were spoken with a slight challenge, as if he did not doubt her understanding, that she would not be left without his attention. The beauty tucked her legs under her, insisting that she wasn't stupid. There was a certain pride in her tone, as if she had already made all the decisions herself and didn't need anyone to remind her of her maturity. Tilting her head to the side, the noblewoman said she thought the man must have known the news. Her words were tinged with a hint of irony, as if she expected him to guess her intentions on his own. Aias thought about it, trying to remember if his interlocutor had noticed anything unusual that could give away his inner experiences, because he was always on guard when communicating with people, especially with people like her. He nervously clenched his hands, playing with his fingers, and asked if any memories had returned to the girl that could reveal his secrets, or at least make it clear that she noticed something important. The noblewoman calmly shrugged her shoulders, and with a light expression on her face, stated that nothing strange had happened in their conversation, and everything they had discussed seemed completely normal to her and no different from an ordinary conversation. The bodies of the young couple sat next to each other, their closeness obvious. Their faces expressed calm and peace, and their behavior was clear agreement and understanding, as if they were part of one whole. The tired beauty yawned, covering her mouth with her hand, which created the impression of a slight loss of strength. But there remained some grace in her gaze, and her figure still remained confident and without unnecessary fuss. The girl, without thinking, decided to take a nap right on the training field, which surprised the knight quite a bit, because he did not expect that someone could fall asleep so carefree and calmly amidst all this fuss and tension. Laying her head on his lap, the noblewoman became quiet, and as if not noticing anything around her, fell asleep in the fresh air, enjoying the peace and quiet, which only increased her sense of security and peace. Aias, who was watching the sleeping girl at that moment, couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking about earlier, because her face expressed some deep feelings hidden from others, and he wanted to understand what was hidden behind this calm appearance. The sleeping face of the beauty looked peaceful and calm. Her facial features were relaxed, and it was clear that her soul at that moment was in complete peace, as if all worries and cares had dissolved in her sleep. Suddenly, the noblewoman began to shiver from the cold. Her body that had seemed so calm and balanced was now showing signs of anxiety, and her face was distorted by the cold wind that caused her to wake up from her sleep. A cold wind blew, and the man, feeling its chill, reached for his sweater, which was lying nearby, trying to quickly find a way to warm up, so as not to allow himself or the girl who was nearby to freeze. Carefully, with a light touch, he covered his new mistress, trying to convey to her all the warmth of his body, hoping that his actions could give her the comfort and protection that she perhaps so needed. Suddenly, during her sleep, the beauty's head and body fell on the knight's chest, leaning against him, which was so unexpected and unusual that he froze for a moment, feeling the warmth of her body pressing her closer to him. Aias flinched in surprise as the aristocrat pressed herself against him in search of warmth, feeling her body seek protection and comfort in his presence, which made his heart skip a beat and his thoughts hesitate from an unknown feeling. A loud cry echoed throughout the castle courtyard, filling the air with alarm and anxiety, as someone called out for their mistress, and his desperate voice echoed, causing everyone to pay attention to this commotion. It was Cain, who was desperately searching for his lady throughout the castle, his steps sounding determined, but each time he encountered empty corridors and unresponsive walls, not understanding where his mistress had disappeared to. The butler took a step forward, but suddenly stopped, his gaze frozen in indecision, as he realized that something unusual was happening that required his attention, and he, not knowing how to act, froze in his movement. The man noticed his mistress sitting in the arms of the knight, their new guard, and at some point he was amazed at what was happening, as he was sure that this was not just an accident, but something deeper that caused him surprise and anxiety. A strong hand grabbed the beauty's shoulder and lifted her up abruptly, waking her up, forcing her to open her eyes, as the sudden movement disturbed her peaceful sleep and attracted the attention of everyone nearby. Cain stood in front of his mistress, ready to protect her, and with fury and malice in his eyes, asked Aias what he had done to her. his voice sounding like a thunderous warning, full of displeasure and a desire for punishment. Aias raised his head in surprise, completely confused, and finding himself a victim in this situation, not understanding what exactly happened and trying to comprehend how everything turned out at such a moment. The butler began to curse the scoundrel, condemning him for what had happened, but suddenly he was abruptly stopped by the cruel voice of the aristocrat, which in an instant cooled his ardor and forced him to remain silent, filling the atmosphere with tension. Celicia asked the guy to release her hand from the strong grip, as the pain from his grip made her feel uncomfortable, and she could not tolerate such a strong grip that caused her pain. With her hands clasped to her chest, Celicia explained that she had dozed off and that Aias was innocent. Her words sounding calm, but confident, an attempt to diffuse the situation and bring everyone back to a more rational perception of what was happening. The man gasped and said he had misunderstood, his face turning purple with embarrassment and the realization of his mistake, which only added to the tension and confusion in his voice. The butler uttered the threats, directing a keen and attentive gaze at the knight, who walked away, ignoring the words full of threats and discontent, and his steps sounded decisive and confident. He left, and the young couple, the butler and his mistress, were left standing in the empty courtyard, surrounded by a silence that seemed almost unbearable after the tension between all the participants in the conflict had subsided. Outside, weapons for training lay on the ground. Spears, shields, and the fire in the torches burned with a bright but calm flame, illuminating the surrounding area, creating a contrast with the storm of emotions that reigned inside. There was a lightning bolt of mutual hatred between the two men, their glances meeting in the blink of an eye, filled with rage and hostility, and each of them tried to prove his case, as if their glances could become weapons. Standing between them, the lady asked wearily what the two were doing and why they were acting so stupidly, her voice sounding a little tired, but still determined, as if she couldn't understand why the men couldn't cope with their emotions and resolve the issue peacefully. On the table, in the shadow of a nearby torch, lay many books that had been read, each of which was the result of long reflection, evidence of study, and an attempt to find answers to questions that had long tormented her. Cain said irritably that the knight was interfering too much in their affairs, and sticking his nose where it was not wanted. His voice was full of displeasure, and he did not hide his irritation with Aias's actions, considering him overly intrusive. Aias replied sternly that he simply wanted their agreement to be fulfilled, and for the lady to regain her memory, his words sounding with a certain determination, because for him, this was an important step, and he was not going to back down. The girl stood among the books, impressed by their number, her gaze filled with curiosity, because the knight wanted her to read all these volumes, which seemed like an almost impossible task, and she could not understand how it was even possible. The men began to quarrel among themselves again, like little children, their disagreements turning into empty squabbles that only added chaos to the already tense atmosphere, without bringing any benefit. Celicia intervened in their conversation, asking the butler when the tailor would arrive to make her a new dress, her voice calm but insistent, as if her request was more important than all the arguments going on around them. The boy's attention suddenly turned to his mistress, and he announced that the seamstresses would be here soon. His face softened a little, and there seemed to be concern in his eyes about satisfying his mistress's needs. Celicia pointed out that they should return to their room, and without arguing, Cain obediently followed her, demonstrating a willingness to follow her instructions, despite his inner irritation and discontent. Aias also headed away in the other direction, but was stopped by the voice of his mistress. Her words penetrated his thoughts, and he, despite the desire to be removed again, found himself drawn into their cycle. The noblewoman insisted that the guard follow them, leaving no room for doubt. Her confidence in safety and need for protection, obvious and firm as a stone wall. With her arms outstretched, Celicia added that anything could happen to her, and that Aias should be there to protect her from possible threats. Her words sounding decisive, like a reminder of the importance of her safety. The noblewoman stood in front of the mirror, trying on a new dress, her gaze reflecting satisfaction with the chosen outfit, and nearby stood the guys and the seamstress watching the process, and each of them was to some extent impressed by what was happening. Many different outfits stood on the mannequin, The dresses were long, expensive, and elegant, each of which could have become a decoration for any important event, and they only emphasized the high status and tastes of their owner. The seamstress admired the lady's figure, on which all the outfits sat perfectly, as if specially designed for her. Her eyes sparkled with pride in her work, and from how perfectly the dress emphasized the beauty of the lady. The men obediently waited for their mistress, who could not choose clothes. Their patience was tested because each of them knew how important the choice of outfit was for her upcoming meetings and events. Standing in a new elegant dress with gold patterns and embellishments, Celicia turned and asked her companions for their opinions, her gaze full of expectation, as if her every choice depended on their reaction. The first dress was white innocent with bright flowers. It seemed to radiate a bright, pure atmosphere, like an outfit suitable for an important and solemn occasion. But the second dress was red bold, and boldly demonstrating a fiery character. Its color spoke of passion and strength, of the desire to be in the center of attention and not remain in the shadows. Celicia agreed with the butler's opinion that these last two dresses looked the best. Her decision was final, and she chose the outfit that emphasized her strength and elegance, combined with what she needed for the next step. Aias flinched, frowning, as he was asked for his opinion, his face momentarily reflecting confusion as he felt his thoughts go astray from the surprise. The man froze in surprise when his answer was interrupted by the lady, who expressed dissatisfaction with the words that all the outfits were good in their own way. She wanted to hear his honest opinion, and this made him think even more about what to do with this choice. The noblewoman ordered the knight to examine her closely and assess her. Her voice was confident, and there was an insistence in it, as if her desire was more important than everything that was happening around her. After which the lady suddenly began to adjust her hair on her neck, as if trying to express something with gestures. Her movements were smooth, but full of hints, and Aias realized that this was her way of conveying a hidden message. And then, baring her neck and back, she noted that beauty was in the details, her words sounding with a subtle hint, as if she was revealing not only external beauty, but also the internal harmony that was hidden by small, barely noticeable features. The man blushed slightly as he saw the lady's delicate skin looking dazzling in her exquisite attire, and gathering his thoughts, he chose a red dress for her that perfectly accentuated her refined beauty. He complimented the noblewoman with a sincere smile, who, dressed in a scarlet outfit, looked so magnificent that her presence overshadowed everything around her, as if she herself had become the center of attention. Cain watched their conversation with jealousy and inner tension, throwing hateful glances at the knight, who seemed to be enjoying the moment, as if adding fuel to the fire of his irritation. Suddenly, both young men simultaneously shuddered, hearing the unexpected words of the lady, who praised them, saying that they had excellent taste, which caused them embarrassment and slight confusion. Celicia, with a slight smile but firmness in her voice, asked the men to finally stop their arguments and quarrels, reminding them that instead of childish squabbles, they should make peace and find a common language. The sky in the evening hours was decorated with a bizarre play of colors, where the pink hue of the clouds smoothly turned into deep blue, creating an atmosphere of peace and anticipation. In the courtyard of the castle, farewell words were heard addressed to the young maiden who was leaving for the celebration, and with all their appearance, the guests wished her a safe journey and a speedy return. Cain watched the carriage carrying Celicia as it moved away, and his heart was filled with a strange mixture of anxiety and desire for her journey to end safely. Aias, standing to the side, also watched the lady's carriage as it departed his eyes, expressing a hidden worry that he tried not to show to others. He warned the lady that going to such a distant place could be dangerous, but her determination proved stronger than his persuasion, and she firmly decided to go to the event. The darkness of the night softly enveloped the sleeping village, where every house was filled with silence and peace, broken only by the light noise of the wind and the rare sounds of night nature. The guildmaster, full of energy and inspiration, spread his arms wide and then announced in a loud voice that he had important news that he had long wanted to tell his old friend. Aias, in a cold and stern voice, asked if the mercenary had managed to find any information about the attacks, his gaze expressing demand and readiness for decisive action. The man with the bright red hair, grinning slyly, began to tell that while he was looking for answers, he had to face many difficulties and obstacles that almost derailed his investigation. After speaking, he smoothly touched the blade, taking it in his hand with apparent confidence, and added that despite all the difficulties, he was still able to find out something that was of great importance. The guildmaster said with a dark malice in his voice that people, when faced with the threat of the blade of death, became much more obedient and willing to make agreements than could be expected under other circumstances. Aias repeated his question with obvious insistence and a tense tone, demanding that the boy name the culprit and reveal who exactly was behind these crimes, and he did not intend to back down until he heard an answer. With the same sly smile, without bothering himself with unnecessary explanations, the man said that the culprit was that very Marquis Gerard, whose reputation was shrouded in mystery and understatement. There was very little reliable information about this aristocrat, and most often he hid in the darkness, avoiding attention, and leaving only barely noticeable traces leading to his mysterious figure. The guildmaster quickly noticed that his friend, judging by the expression on his face, clearly did not expect such an answer, and looked extremely surprised, as if he had heard something completely unbelievable. Placing his hand on his old friend's shoulder, the man with good-natured severity advised him not to give in to emotions and to remain rational, because in such situations, a sober mind was more important than anything else. The celebration included a sumptuous banquet, where aristocrats stood in small groups, animatedly discussing current events and sharing impressions of the day. The table was strewn with a huge number of dishes, among which stood out exquisite delicacies, sweets, and various dishes from which it was impossible to take your eyes off. The nobles were absolutely delighted by the luxury that reigned all around, noting how carefully the decoration was thought out, and admiring how expensive and elegant everything looked. One of the aristocrats, holding a glass of wine in his hand, thanked the count with a sincere smile for the superbly organized celebration, noting that every detail had been worked out with the highest taste. The fat old man burst into loud laughter and began to boast of his wealth, declaring with a careless smile that all this luxury was just a trifle for him, not worth much effort. Suddenly, the younger nobles, with genuine interest in their eyes, asked the count whether the ruler would be present at this party, as if it was a key question on which much depended. Putting his glass down on the table with slight irritation, Evelyn replied dryly that Edgar, as always, had sent a polite refusal, notifying that he would not be able to attend the celebration, which the count, judging by his tone, had long ceased to be surprised by. With a barely noticeable grin, the count added that even if this little prince had deigned to come, it was unlikely that anyone here would have greeted him with joy or sincere hospitality. The men began to actively discuss the latest rumors, enthusiastically sharing their speculations and assumptions, when suddenly a human figure quickly headed towards their table, almost breaking into a run. It turned out to be one of the count's servants, who quickly approached him and began to whisper important news in his ear in a quiet voice, causing the aristocrat to frown and listen intently to every word. At that moment, the massive door swung open, and a hall opened up before the nobles, where it became clear that an unexpected guest had arrived, whose appearance, judging by the reaction, no one expected. The nobles, shocked to the depths of their souls, began to look around in surprise, whispering to each other and trying to understand what exactly was happening. Lady Celicia herself showed up at the event dressed in a gorgeous new red dress, and everyone was shocked because she had been thought dead for 5 years. To the whispers of the shocked guests, the noblewoman walked forward with grace and confidence, each step of her red shoes echoing with a soft tap on the floor, attracting the attention of everyone in the hall. The girl, expecting such a violent reaction to her appearance, completely ignored the rumors and surprised looks, concentrating on her goal and not allowing emotions to take over. The count, standing right in front of her, looked extremely displeased. His face was tense, and he was holding a drink in his hand, which contrasted with his fat belly and the image of an old greedy man. The noblewoman put on a polite smile, made an elegant curtsy, and greeted the organizer of the celebration with noble restraint, trying to comply with all the secular rules. A loud laugh rang out in response, and the nobleman declared with unnecessary loudness that he had not seen this beauty for a long time, as if trying to put his surprise on display for all to see. Passing by Celicia, He rudely noted that she very rarely left her residence and almost never appeared at celebrations, balls, or banquets, hinting at her alienation. With a cruel grin, the Count continued, adding that he had always been concerned about her health because, according to him, she was supposed to live a long and happy life. Although there was obvious suspicion in his tone, the nobles around began to utter forced pleasantries, picking up on the Count's mood, and before leaving, he with false concern wished the lady a pleasant evening and walked away with a satisfied step. However, the man froze, startled by the words of the noblewoman, who said after him that she knew perfectly well that all the gifts she received were from him. Opening his mouth in surprise, the old man turned around sharply, looking closely at his interlocutor's face, as if trying to understand what exactly she meant and how deep her awareness could be. A sly, knowing smile appeared on the aristocrat's face, which clearly hinted that she possessed many secrets, but preferred to keep them secret like hidden trump cards up her sleeve. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the noise of other voices. Other ladies who called Celicia had approached and were soon standing nearby, carefully watching what was happening. The girls greeted the noblewoman with sincere respect, began to talk animatedly with her, and admitted that they had not seen her in society for a long time, surprised by her sudden appearance. Evelyn, apparently deciding to take control of the situation, smiled, and with exaggerated politeness, invited Celicia to talk with the other aristocrats while he prepared a separate room for them for more private communication. Celicia clapped her hands and announced with a joyful but somewhat forced smile that she would look forward to this moment, demonstrating courtesy in her manner. The Count, with obvious cunning in his eyes, was quietly discussing some evil plan with his servant, clearly plotting something extremely unpleasant, and his voice sounded ominous even in the hushed conversation. Celicia, taking a confident step forward, decided that she had to follow the Count to understand what he was planning, and her determination showed in her stern gaze. Turning to the other aristocrats, she asked them with an apologetic smile to wait a little, since she suddenly had more important matters that required her attention. As a plausible excuse, Celicia pressed her hand to her face, noting that she still felt a little sick from the carriage sickness, making everyone think that she really needed to be alone. Laughing awkwardly, the noblewoman announced that she intended to go out for some fresh air, hoping that this would allow her to come to her senses and refresh her thoughts. The night sky above the castle was a deep blue. The full moon illuminated the clouds, and the stars shimmered, creating a beautiful yet ominous backdrop. The Count, gliding through the empty corridors of the castle, moved forward, and the moonlight falling on his face gave his appearance an even more suspicious and gloomy hue. Hiding behind the columns of the rich corridor, Celicia carefully, almost silently, followed the strange aristocrat, who with his behavior radiated something unusually vile and suspicious, as if he was hiding a dark secret. Despite the luxurious furnishings of the corridor in the mansion, there was not a single guard to be seen around, which looked completely strange considering the status and importance of this place. The girl's shadow, illuminated by the soft moonlight, glided along the walls as she held her breath, watching the man's every step like a hunter watching his prey. Suddenly, another figure appeared from behind her, its shadow smoothly enveloping Celicia. It was a knight with a sword, holding the weapon in his hands as if he was about to strike. There was a dull thud, and Celicia fell to the floor like a doll, limp and fragile, the moonlight softly illuminating her sprawled figure in the silent hallway. Meanwhile, in the hall, where the event was still going on, whispers and rumors began to spread that Madame Celicia had suddenly disappeared somewhere, and despite expectations, had never returned. The aristocrats could not help but whisper excitedly, and began to discuss the engagement that had once existed between the prince and the beautiful lady, who had recently returned to high society, expressing surprise and curiosity about her return. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a strange voice, and another person approached them, clearly interested in their conversation, which instantly attracted the attention of the girls, and they fell silent, feeling that someone had joined their conversation. When the aristocrats found out who was hiding behind this unknown man, their faces were filled with amazement, and they instantly froze in horror, realizing that in front of them stood none other than Edgar himself. The prince, with his short blonde hair perfectly styled, and a cold gaze that seemed to pierce everyone, was dressed in a light suit decorated with refined details, which only emphasized his aristocratic majesty. The man, concentrating on turning his head in different directions, looked more carefully for his ex-fiancée with each step, as if hoping to find her among the many people, but she was not in any corner of the hall. However, despite all his efforts and attentive glances, he could not find the noblewoman among the multitude of other aristocrats, of whom there were so many that she was lost among their bright clothes and lively conversations. With respect and grace, the aristocratic ladies bowed in reverence before the heir to the throne, greeting him, as is proper, with all due signs of respect and reverence for the high title and power of this majestic man. In an instant, the attention of the other nobles was also drawn to the appearance of the heir to the throne, whom no one expected to see at this celebration, which caused slight surprise and quiet conversations among those gathered. But for the heir to the throne himself, there was no more important question than where Lady Celicia was at the moment, and he, without hiding his concern, immediately declared that he needed to find her in order to find out what had happened to her. The architecture of the bridge, illuminated by the cold night light, was a striking contrast, and at that moment, in the shadows and silence, a crime was committed hidden from all view as the darkness of night conceals the darkest secrets. Suddenly, footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and a man's heavy boots broke the silence as he climbed the steps, his gait confident and determined, as if he already knew what awaited him at the end of the road. It was the Count himself, who, seeing the captured noblewoman, did not hold back his mockery and laughed sarcastically, watching her helpless appearance sitting on the floor, which only strengthened his feeling of superiority. Her hands were cruelly tied with a rope twisted behind her back, which added to the tragedy of the situation, and in the eyes of this unfortunate woman, one could see despair, the realization of her powerlessness in the face of the power of this man. The scoundrel's hand began to slide through the girl's hair. With a hateful gesture, his fingers felt her rough curls, as if enjoying the moment of his power, and she, in turn, held back sighs of fear and pain. The man, suddenly lifting the captive's head by the hair, realized with horror that before him was not an innocent maiden, but a bound messenger, who now, with a helpless expression on his face, became the object of his hatred and surprise. The Count, in complete fear, screamed in shock. His face turned pale, and his body, as if mown down, recoiled before he fell to the floor, his eyes reflecting a horror that could not be hidden from anyone. Trembling with bewilderment, Evelyn began to hastily ask where the beautiful lady had gone. Had she really run away? And why was his knight tied up instead of standing next to him and protecting him? Suddenly, a mocking laugh was heard, and Celicia herself appeared before the fallen Count, mockingly looking down at him, as if enjoying this moment, her eyes sparkling with cunning sparkles. Now it was her turn to ridicule the nobleman. Her eyes were full of mischief, and the moonlight reflected from her graceful figure emphasized her beauty, which seemed almost unreal, as if it had been created by nature itself. There was not a single living soul in the courtyard. No guards, no servants, silence ponds, gazebos. Everything was absorbed by the night atmosphere, which was created by complete emptiness and silence. The man leaned his hand on the railing, trying to stand up, but his movements were uncertain and stuttering. He tried to address the aristocrat, trying to say something, but his words sounded like a barely audible whisper. Getting to his feet, Evelyn tried to blame the noblewoman for allegedly attacking his guards, although everyone saw how his own knight was tied up, and Celicia herself was in control of the situation. As soon as the lady snapped her fingers, and her voice became icy and stern, she said that with every next move the Count made, he would burn with flames, and her words sounded with such calmness that they seemed threatening and inevitable. A magical seal suddenly appeared beneath the old man's feet, sparkling and pulsating with an ominous light, as if the very ground beneath him was ready to open up and swallow him. Fiery flashes began to circle around the man, dangerous and fast. They sparkled like poisonous snakes ready to incinerate everything in their path, making the air around hot and unbearable. Finally, it dawned on Evelyn that all his previous attempts to kill the lady had failed. She was a mage. Her power was so great that he had underestimated her capabilities and paid for his overconfidence. In shock, frozen in horror, the aristocrat asked himself who this woman was in front of him, who was so fearlessly using magic to gain the upper hand over him and his guards losing control with every passing moment. The man stood there, his mouth open, his eyes wide, like a man who had just realized the gravity of his situation. In front of him was the very woman he had tried to destroy. The beauty appeared before him as a true Celicia, smiling meanly and haughtily. Her gaze was full of insolence, and her presence before him suddenly became threatening, as if she could destroy him with just one word. Suddenly, the nobleman screamed indignantly, not believing his own ears. How could this woman allow herself to behave with him in this way, because he was not only rich, but also an influential man who was accustomed to everyone respecting his power? The noblewoman, without showing the slightest fear, persistently asked why Evelyn so strongly desired her death, since he was ready to do anything to rid himself of her presence.